What if the greatest turning point in human history didn't begin with kings' pyramids or mighty empires, but with a simple fire burning inside a humble home? Long before cities rose and civilizations conquered the world, ancient hearths became the places where families gathered, stories were shared, and the first foundations of society quietly took shape. Tonight we'll journey back thousands of years to discover how these forgotten fires changed humanity forever. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let the warmth of history guide you into a peaceful night's rest. A circle of darkened earth lies beneath layers of wind-blown dust. At first glance, it seems almost too ordinary to deserve attention. There are no towering walls, no carved statues, no royal tombs glittering with gold. Only a patch of ancient ash, fragments of charcoal no larger than a fingernail, and stones arranged in a rough ring that has not felt warmth for thousands of years. Yet this quiet stain in the soil may tell a greater story than many palaces ever could. Long before cities reached toward the sky, before kings claimed rivers, before writing preserved the names of rulers, there were places like this. They were small enough for a family to gather around, yet powerful enough to reshape the future of humanity. The landscape surrounding the forgotten hearth appears almost timeless. Grass bends beneath a cool evening breeze. Distant hills soften into the horizon. Somewhere nearby, a stream continues its patient journey, following a course that may have changed only slightly since the last flames flickered here. The people who once tended this fire have vanished without leaving names. Their voices have dissolved into silence. Their footsteps disappeared beneath countless seasons of rain and dust. Yet their fire remains not in flame, but in memory written into the ground itself. Before going deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The earliest chapters of civilization do not begin with monuments, they begin with repetition. A fire lit once leaves little behind. A fire returned to again and again begins to change the landscape. Ash accumulates. Charcoal settles into the soil. Broken bones gather nearby. Stone tools are sharpened, repaired, and discarded within easy reach. Children grow beside familiar flames instead of sleeping in a different place every night. Slowly, almost invisibly, a location becomes something more than a campsite. It becomes home. This transformation does not happen suddenly. No single generation wakes one morning and decides that civilization has arrived. Instead, thousands of ordinary choices slowly reshape human existence. Someone returns because the spring still flows. Another because the hunting remains good. Others because familiar trees offer shelter from harsh winds. Eventually, returning becomes habit, and habit becomes tradition. Fire itself has already travelled a long journey before reaching this moment. Human ancestors likely learned to control naturally occurring flames long before they consistently create them. Lightning strikes ignite forests. Volcanic eruptions spread burning debris across dry grasslands. At first, people probably protect existing embers rather than making new ones. Carrying fire becomes almost as important as finding food. A dying flame means starting over, perhaps waiting for another natural source. Only much later does reliable fire-making become widespread enough to remove that uncertainty. Once fire becomes dependable, everything around it begins to change. Night no longer belongs entirely to predators. Darkness retreats beyond the circle of light. Cold seasons become more survivable. Meat cooks more thoroughly, reducing harmful organisms and making nutrients easier to absorb. Hard roots soften into nourishing meals. Smoke drives away many insects. Wood hardens into stronger spear points. Hides dry beside glowing embers. Even the rhythm of conversation changes. Instead of ending with sunset, the day stretches into evening. Around these fires, something equally important unfolds. Knowledge stays alive. One person demonstrates how to shape a stone blade. Another remembers where migrating animals crossed the valley the previous winter. Someone recognizes which berries become safe only after cooking. A child watches without fully understanding, then repeats those lessons years later. Fire creates not only warmth, but also time after darkness falls, when survival no longer demands constant movement and attention. What survives in the archaeological record suggests that these evening hours become one of humanity's greatest invisible inventions. Stories cannot fossilize. Songs leave no imprint in stone. Advice spoken softly across glowing coals disappears into the night air. Yet their effects endure. Complex skills require observation. Observation requires patience. Patience flourishes where people remain together for extended periods. A dependable hearth creates exactly those conditions. Modern excavations repeatedly uncover this quiet pattern across widely separated regions of the world. In parts of Africa, the Levant, Europe, and Asia, ancient hearths appear again and again within sites occupied over long periods. Their precise ages differ greatly. Their builders belong to different cultures and sometimes even different human species. Nevertheless, the underlying behavior appears remarkably familiar. Fires are placed carefully. Activity concentrates nearby. Daily life organizes itself around warmth, light, food, preparation, and cooperation. Scholars still debate exactly when permanent hearth-centered living becomes widespread. The evidence remains incomplete because ash disappears easily. Wind scatters charcoal. Rain dissolves fragile traces. Burrowing animals disturb ancient layers. Entire landscapes sink beneath rivers or vanish beneath expanding cities. Even so, enough survives to reveal an unmistakable pattern. Whenever people begin returning repeatedly to the same fire, their relationship with the land begins to shift. Instead of merely passing through a landscape, they begin investing in it. The ground itself changes under repeated occupation. Tiny fragments of burned bone enrich the soil. Charcoal alters its chemistry. Discarded stone flakes accumulate. Plant remains become trapped beneath successive layers of ash. Centuries later, archaeologists sometimes recognize these invisible signatures before any obvious structures appear. The hearth often announces human presence long before walls or foundations emerge. This is one reason ancient fireplaces fascinate researchers so deeply. They preserve moments that monuments rarely capture. A palace celebrates rulers, a hearth records ordinary life. Within a single layer of ash, investigators may discover evidence of meals, seasons, weather technology, and migration. Burned seeds reveal what plants were gathered. Fish bones hint at nearby waterways. Animal remains suggest hunting patterns. Tiny grains of pollen trapped in sediments reconstruct vanished forests. Even microscopic traces of soot can reveal the kinds of wood burned thousands of years ago. Every fire becomes a silent archive. Sometimes the discoveries are surprisingly intimate. The arrangement of stones may indicate where people preferred to sit. Heat fractures on nearby rocks reveal repeated cooking. Clusters of tool fragments suggest someone repaired hunting equipment, while others prepared food. Burn marks inside animal bones indicate roasting techniques remarkably similar to methods still used in many parts of the world today. These details rarely attract the dramatic headlines reserved for lost pyramids or buried temples, yet they answer a far deeper question. How does civilization actually begin? Not with an emperor issuing laws, not with architects raising monuments, not with merchants counting wealth. Instead, the earliest foundations emerge through repeated acts so ordinary that they almost disappear from history altogether, tending a fire before dawn, gathering wood before winter, preparing food for others, teaching children beside glowing embers, returning again and again to the same patch of earth. until that place becomes woven into memory. As the centuries pass, countless hearths appear across continents that never know one another. Their builders speak different languages, hunt different animals, and adapt to different climates. Yet they all participate in the same quiet revolution. Without intending to build civilizations, they create the conditions from which civilizations eventually grow. The first cities remain unimaginably distant. Writing has not yet appeared. Empires exist only as possibilities hidden far beyond the horizon. But beneath the smoke rising from these modest fires, something irreversible has already begun. The ancient hearth is no longer simply a place where flames burn. It has become the still centre around which human lives slowly learn to remain. Morning arrives long before the sun clears the horizon. The fire has not gone out completely. Beneath a blanket of pale grey ash, small pockets of orange still glow, protected through the coldest hours of the night. Someone kneels beside the hearth and gently stirs the embers with a stick. Dry grass catches, first followed by twigs gathered the evening before. Thin strands of smoke drift upward into the still air. Within moments the familiar crackle returns, and with it the beginning of another ordinary day. Nothing about the scene appears remarkable, yet this simple act repeated over generations beyond counting quietly changes the course of human history. A fire that survives the night is different from one built only for a single meal. It demands planning. Fuel must be collected before darkness falls. Suitable wood must be recognized and stored. Rain must be anticipated. Children learn which branches burn quickly and which provide slow, lasting heat. Older members of the community understand how to bank embers beneath ash, so that dawn requires only patience rather than starting from nothing. These habits seem almost invisible when viewed over the span of a single day, but across centuries they create an entirely new rhythm of life. Movement, once the defining feature of human existence, begins to slow. For countless generations, small bands of hunter-gatherers travel across immense territories, following migrating animals, ripening plants, changing seasons, and shifting water sources. Mobility remains essential for survival, and for many communities it continues successfully for thousands of years. Even today, archaeologists caution against imagining a single inevitable path toward permanent settlement. The evidence shows remarkable diversity. Some groups remain highly mobile, while others gradually establish longer seasonal occupations. No single explanation fully accounts for this transformation, because different environments encourage different strategies. Yet what survives in the archaeological record suggests that certain places begin exerting an unusual pull. Freshwater rarely disappears overnight. Rivers flood, but they also return. Springs flow through dry seasons. Lakes attract birds, fish, grazing animals, edible plants, and eventually people. A campsite established beside dependable water often becomes easier to revisit than to replace. Each return reduces uncertainty. The best fishing spots are already known. Nearby stone suitable for tools has already been located. Fruit trees bloom in familiar patterns. Dangerous marshes are remembered. Safe crossings become tradition rather than discovery. The hearth sits quietly at the centre of this growing familiarity. Unlike temporary campfires built during long journeys, these fires become landmarks. Their stones remain even after flames fade. Layers of ash accumulate beneath new layers of occupation. Children born one spring return to the same fire during the next. Elders recognize particular rocks blackened by years of cooking. Memory begins attaching itself not only to landscapes, but to specific places within those landscapes. Home in its earliest recognizable form is less about architecture than about return. This distinction matters because the first enduring homes often leave almost no visible buildings behind. Wooden poles decay, Animal hides disappear. Woven shelters collapse into soil. The hearth alone frequently survives, preserving the invisible outline of domestic life long after every roof has vanished. Archaeologists sometimes reconstruct entire camps from nothing more than clusters of fireplaces, scattered tools, and subtle changes in the surrounding earth. The spaces between these hearths also tell stories. Some fires stand alone, suggesting individual family groups. Others appear in carefully organized clusters, indicating several households sharing nearby resources. In a few remarkable sites, repeated rebuilding follows nearly identical patterns for generations. Even when structures vanish, people continue placing new hearths almost exactly where older ones once burned. Such consistency hints at more than convenience. It suggests attachment. Scholars remain cautious when interpreting these patterns because human emotions do not fossilize. No ancient inscription explains why a family returns to one particular patch of ground instead of another. Still, the repeated placement of hearths strongly implies that certain locations acquire meaning extending beyond immediate survival. Perhaps ancestors once lived there. Perhaps nearby hunting remains especially reliable. Perhaps children buried close to camp transform the landscape into something impossible to abandon completely. The evidence remains incomplete, but the persistence itself is striking. As people spend longer periods in one place, daily life grows increasingly predictable. Predictability creates opportunities that constant movement rarely allows. Heavy objects become worth keeping because they no longer need to be carried over great distances. Grinding stones used for processing seeds remain beside the hearth instead of travelling across valleys. Larger storage containers begin appearing in some regions. Collections of useful materials slowly accumulate. Possessions, modest though they are, become part of the landscape. This subtle change influences nearly every aspect of existence. Food preparation expands beyond immediate necessity. Meat can be dried over slow fires. Nuts gathered during autumn remain available weeks later. Roots harvested in abundance no longer require immediate consumption, although true agriculture still lies in the future. For many communities, longer occupations encourage experimentation with storage and preservation. People begin thinking not only about today's meal, but about next month's scarcity. Fire makes such planning possible. Smoke preserves fish and meat. Gentle heat dries edible plants. Hardened clay near hearth edges occasionally reveals accidental discoveries about earth transformed by fire. At first, these changes are incidental rather than intentional. A lump of wet clay dropped beside a fire dries into a surprisingly durable object. Burned stones retain heat longer than expected. Certain minerals change color dramatically after exposure to high temperatures. Each observation enters the growing reservoir of practical knowledge shared within the community. Knowledge itself also becomes increasingly local. A mobile group certainly carries experience across great distances, but a more settled community learns the personality of a single landscape in astonishing detail. They know where spring floods leave fertile patches. They recognize which hills warm first after winter. They observe birds arriving earlier some years than others. They remember which trees survive drought. Such familiarity accumulates gradually generation after generation until the environment is understood not as an abstract wilderness but as a living partner whose rhythms can be anticipated. The hearth serves as the place where these observations are woven together. Evening after evening, practical information passes from older hands to younger ones. No written records exist. No maps are drawn. Yet memory grows remarkably sophisticated. Children absorb seasonal calendars through repeated experience. They learn which stars rise when fish begin migrating. They recognize changes in wind that signal approaching storms. They understand that certain plants appear only after particular rains. These lessons become inseparable from the place where they are taught. Archaeologists increasingly recognize that such intangible knowledge may have been as valuable as any physical tool. A finely crafted spear can be lost. A stone blade eventually breaks. But understanding the land, knowing where to find water during drought, which valley shelters game in harsh winters, or which plants remain edible after frost can sustain an entire community for generations. The quiet stability provided by enduring hearths allows this knowledge to deepen beyond what constant movement alone might encourage. None of this means that early people suddenly abandon travel. Far from it. Seasonal movement continues across much of the world for thousands of years. Communities visit distant hunting grounds, exchange valuable stone encounter, neighboring groups, and adapt continually to changing climates. Settlement exists on a spectrum rather than as a single revolutionary event. Some hearths burn only during one season each year. Others remain active for decades. A few evolve into places occupied so consistently that they begin resembling villages long before anyone would recognize them as such. The transformation is so gradual that those living through it likely never perceive it at all. One generation simply returns because its parents always did. The next repairs an older fireplace rather than building a new one. Another clears nearby brush to improve visibility. Children grow into adults believing this rhythm has always existed. Centuries pass, ash deepens. The circle of stones remains warm through another winter. Without proclamation or ceremony, humanity is beginning to anchor itself to the earth in ways that will eventually make fields, towns, temples, and civilizations possible. Yet all of that still lies far beyond the horizon. For now, the ancient hearth asks for nothing more than another armful of wood and another evening spent around its steady light. The fire itself disappears long before the story it leaves behind. Flames consume wood within hours, smoke drifts into the sky, and warmth fades before dawn. Yet beneath the surface, hidden from sight, an extraordinary archive begins to form. Every meal cooked, every branch burned, every tool repaired beside the glowing coals leaves behind traces so small that the people creating them never notice. Thousands of years later, those almost invisible remains become some of the most valuable evidence archaeologists possess. Entire chapters of early human history emerge not from grand monuments, but from tiny fragments resting quietly beneath layers of earth. An excavation rarely begins with dramatic discoveries. More often, it starts with patience. Archaeologists remove soil centimetre by centimetre, recording each subtle change in colour and texture. A patch of darker sediment may appear almost insignificant, until closer inspection reveals flecks of charcoal scattered through it. Burned stones emerge cracked by repeated heating and cooling. Tiny bone fragments begin appearing nearby, often too small to identify with the naked eye. What first resembles an ordinary stain slowly resolves into the unmistakable outline of an ancient hearth. Unlike castles or temples, these fireplaces demand careful interpretation. A single misplaced shovel can destroy information that has survived for 10,000 years. Modern excavation therefore resembles detective work more than treasure hunting. Every layer is photographed before removal. Every object is mapped with remarkable precision. Even the surrounding soil is collected because it may contain microscopic evidence invisible during excavation. Increasingly, archaeologists understand that the smallest discoveries often carry the greatest significance. Charcoal, for example, appears deceptively simple. To the casual observer, it is merely burned wood. To specialists, however, charcoal can reveal entire vanished forests. Different tree species possess distinctive microscopic structures that survive even after burning. Under magnification, researchers sometimes identify whether ancient people gathered oak, pine, willow, juniper, or dozens of other varieties. This knowledge helps reconstruct long-lost landscapes, showing which environments surrounded a settlement and how people selected fuel. Sometimes these findings challenge long-held assumptions. A site once believed to exist within open grassland may instead reveal evidence of nearby woodland. Another may demonstrate that forests gradually disappeared through climate change rather than extensive human cutting. No single explanation fully accounts for every environmental shift, but charcoal frequently becomes one of the most reliable witnesses available. Burned seeds tell equally remarkable stories. Many plants rarely survive thousands of years unless fire accidentally preserves them. Carbonization transforms delicate organic material into surprisingly durable remains. Wheat grains, barley kernels, acorns, lentils, peas, figs, wild grasses, berries, and countless other species occasionally endure because they pass briefly through intense heat without being completely consumed. Each seed becomes a tiny record of human choice. Some indicate gathering from nearby meadows, others suggest early cultivation. A few reveal trade or seasonal movement because they originate from regions many days away. When hundreds of seeds accumulate around repeated hearths, patterns begin emerging that no single discovery could reveal. Researchers also examine pollen trapped within ancient sediments. These microscopic grains drift through the air each flowering season before settling onto the ground. Buried beneath successive layers of occupation, they preserve a surprisingly detailed environmental record. Forest expansion, grassland decline, changing rainfall, and even the arrival of cultivated crops sometimes become visible through pollen analysis alone. Together, charcoal and pollen transform fireplaces into windows overlooking entire ecosystems. Animal bones add another layer to the story. Not every bone survives equally well. Some shatter during cooking, others burn completely. Still enough remains to reconstruct surprisingly detailed diets. Deer, wild cattle, fish, birds, rabbits, shellfish, tortoises, and countless smaller animals all appear at ancient hearths across different regions. Their distribution reveals hunting strategies, seasonal occupations, and changing environments. Cut marks made by stone tools often remain visible under magnification. These fine incisions distinguish human activity from the tooth marks left by wolves, hyenas, or other predators. Fractures caused while extracting marrow differ from breaks created naturally after burial. Burn patterns indicate whether meat was roasted directly over flames or cooked using heated stones. Even the age of hunted animals matters. Communities consistently targeting mature adults may follow different strategies from those relying heavily upon younger individuals. Such details help archaeologists understand not only what people ate, but how they organized hunting shared resources and adapted to changing conditions. Sometimes the most remarkable evidence comes from things almost impossible to see. Soil samples carried back to laboratories reveal microscopic fragments known as phytoliths. These tiny silica structures form inside many plants during life and survive long after leaves, stems, and seeds decay. Different species produce distinctive shapes. By studying phytoliths recovered from hearth sediments, scientists sometimes identify plants that leave no other visible traces. Tiny starch grains trapped on stone tools offer another unexpected source of information. Grinding stones, once used to process roots or seeds, often preserve microscopic residues within their rough surfaces. Thousands of years later, laboratory analysis identifies which foods passed across those stones. The meals themselves vanished ages ago, yet invisible particles continue telling their story. Heat leaves its signature everywhere. Rocks repeatedly exposed to fire develop characteristic cracks and color changes. Clay hardens. Minerals transform. Even the magnetic properties of certain sediments shift after intense heating. Modern scientific instruments detect these alterations with extraordinary precision. allowing researchers to distinguish genuine hearths from naturally burned areas. Radiocarbon dating frequently begins with charcoal collected from ancient fireplaces. Because living trees absorb carbon throughout their lives, burned wood retains a measurable record of when it stopped growing. Careful analysis estimates when the fire burned, often within surprisingly narrow ranges, although every dating method carries margins of uncertainty. Radiocarbon analysis has revolutionized understanding of prehistoric chronology. Still, scholars remain cautious. A piece of wood may already have been centuries old before someone burned it. Floods can disturb archaeological layers. Burrowing animals move material unexpectedly. Roots penetrate ancient deposits. Every conclusion requires careful comparison with multiple lines of evidence. The evidence remains incomplete, and archaeologists constantly refine earlier interpretations as new discoveries emerge. Perhaps the greatest strength of hearth archaeology lies not in any single artifact but in context. A lone stone tool reveals little by itself. A stone tool beside burned bone surrounded by charcoal accompanied by seeds, pollen phytoliths and repeated occupation layers begins revealing an entire way of life. Patterns become visible only when countless small details are considered together. One hearth may represent an isolated camping stop. 10 successive hearths occupying the same location across centuries suggests something far more enduring. This cumulative approach has transformed understanding of humanity's deep past over the past several decades. Earlier generations of archaeology often focused upon spectacular objects, gold ornaments, monumental architecture, elaborate burials. Those discoveries remain important, but researchers increasingly appreciate that ordinary domestic spaces frequently answer larger historical questions. Civilization does not emerge inside palaces first. It develops through ordinary routines repeated countless times. The humble fireplace captures those routines with remarkable honesty. There is little opportunity for deliberate display. A ruler may commission an impressive monument designed to project power. An ordinary family cooking supper has no reason to stage its activities for future archaeologists. The resulting evidence, therefore, feels unusually authentic. Burned food, broken tools, scattered bones, and discarded ash record everyday existence with little embellishment. Occasionally, these quiet discoveries overturn dramatic assumptions. Sites once interpreted as temporary camps reveal evidence of repeated occupation stretching across generations. Regions thought incapable of supporting substantial populations prove surprisingly productive. Communities previously regarded as simple hunter-gatherers demonstrate sophisticated environmental management and remarkably stable settlement patterns. Each ancient hearth reminds researchers that history often grows from overlooked details rather than spectacular events. A civilization's deepest roots rarely announce themselves with grandeur. Instead, they accumulate slowly beneath layers of ash. One evening meal after another, one winter survived after another, one generation teaching the next, beside the steady glow of familiar embers. Long after the flames vanish, the earth continues remembering every small act of care, cooperation, and persistence. It is these quiet records hidden beneath ordinary soil that allow the distant beginning of civilization to emerge once more into the light. As evening settles across the landscape, the pace of the day begins to soften. Hunting parties return carrying whatever fortune has granted them. Some arrive with fresh meat balanced across wooden poles. Others bring baskets filled with roots, berries, nuts, or edible greens gathered from river banks and forest edges. Children carry smaller bundles of dry branches collected along familiar paths. Older members of the community remain near the fire, tending slow-burning logs and preparing the space where another meal will soon unfold. No written record describes these moments, yet archaeological evidence suggests that scenes much like this repeat across thousands of years and across continents separated by immense distances. The hearth is no longer simply a source of heat. It has become the place where separate lives briefly merge into something larger. Unlike hunting, which often divides people into smaller working groups, preparing and sharing food repeatedly brings them back together. The day's experiences converge beside the flames. Game is divided, plants are sorted, water is heated. Stones warmed in the fire may be transferred into containers to boil foods that cannot be roasted directly. Bones are cracked to extract rich marrow. Fat drips onto glowing embers, sending familiar scents into the cooling evening air. These routines seem almost universal because they solve practical problems while quietly strengthening social ones. Anthropologists studying both ancient evidence and more recent traditional societies have long noted that shared meals create obligations extending beyond simple nutrition. Food gathered by one individual frequently feeds many others. Success and failure become collective experiences rather than purely personal ones. A successful hunt benefits children too young to participate, older people whose strength has diminished, and individuals recovering from illness or injury. This pattern of sharing may have been one of humanity's greatest evolutionary advantages. No single explanation fully accounts for the extraordinary success of our species, but cooperation consistently appears as one of its defining strengths. The hearth provides a reliable setting where cooperation becomes visible every single day. Food itself changes when prepared over controlled fire. Cooking breaks down tough fibers, making many plants easier to digest. Meat softens, allowing nutrients to be absorbed more efficiently. Certain naturally occurring toxins found in roots and seeds are reduced through heating. Some foods become edible only after prolonged cooking. Others become safer by eliminating harmful microorganisms. The transformation seems so familiar today that it is easy to overlook its significance. For early communities, cooked food often means more available energy from the same resources. That extra energy supports growing children, prolonged activity, and increasingly complex social lives. Scholars continue debating the precise role cooking plays in human evolution, particularly regarding earlier stages involving species such as Homo erectus. The timing remains uncertain because direct evidence is difficult to preserve. Nevertheless, what survives in the archaeological record strongly suggests that mastery of cooking profoundly reshapes human existence long before the first villages appear. Around the hearth, cooking also creates waiting time. Roasting large cuts of meat cannot be rushed. Thick roots require patience. Nuts are easier to process after gentle heating. During these pauses, hands remain busy while minds become available for other purposes. Stone tools are sharpened, wooden shafts are repaired, fibers are twisted into cordage, animal hides are scraped clean. Children imitate adult tasks using smaller tools of their own. Knowledge moves quietly through observation. No formal teacher stands before a class. There are no written instructions or carved diagrams. Instead, learning unfolds through countless small demonstrations repeated beside familiar fires. A child watches an experienced toolmaker strike flakes from a stone core with astonishing precision. Weeks later, the same movements are attempted with awkward hands. Failure is common. So is encouragement through example rather than explanation. Generations pass in this manner. The techniques grow more refined without ever being written down. Experimental archaeologists who recreate ancient technologies using traditional materials often discover just how difficult many prehistoric skills actually are. Producing a finely balanced stone blade requires remarkable control. Shaping bone into durable needles demands patience measured in hours. Creating effective adhesives by heating tree resins with other natural ingredients involves careful temperature management. Such knowledge cannot easily be invented independently each generation. It must be transmitted. The hearth becomes the classroom where civilization first learns to remember itself. Stories likely play an equally important role, although they leave almost no direct archaeological trace. Language disappears the moment it is spoken. Songs vanish with the final note. Yet many researchers believe that evening gatherings around dependable fires greatly expand opportunities for oral tradition. Hunting experiences are retold, dangerous places are remembered, seasonal migrations of animals become part of collective memory. Children hear accounts of ancestors whose names may eventually stretch back through many generations. Some of these stories undoubtedly entertain, others preserve practical survival information. Modern indigenous traditions around the world sometimes encode astonishing ecological knowledge within narratives passed orally across centuries. Rivers prone to flooding dangerous coastlines, medicinal plants, animal behavior and seasonal changes all become easier to remember when woven into memorable stories. Although direct comparisons between modern and prehistoric societies must always be made carefully, they illustrate how oral cultures preserve complex knowledge without writing. The fire provides both the light and the audience for such traditions. As darkness deepens beyond the circle of illumination, attention naturally turns inward. Faces become more visible than distant landscapes. Conversation grows easier than travel. The physical limits imposed by night encourage social interaction rather than movement. Even silence acquires a different quality. Watching flames requires little effort. The shifting light calms restless activity. Long before artificial lighting transforms human schedules, the hearth establishes an evening rhythm that balances work with reflection. Archaeological discoveries occasionally hint at activities extending beyond simple survival. Pieces of ochre bearing signs of grinding appear at some sites. Red, yellow, and black pigments may have been used for decorating bodies, objects, or perhaps even surrounding spaces. Shell beads pierced for stringing emerge at others. Animal teeth modified into ornaments suggest symbolic expression. None of these objects are necessary for immediate survival, yet they repeatedly appear near domestic spaces centered upon fire. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars continue debating exactly how such items were used. Even so, their presence suggests that the hearth nurtures not only practical skills but cultural identity. People begin expressing who they are, not merely how they survive. Shared customs likely become increasingly important as communities grow more stable. Perhaps certain foods are always prepared first. Perhaps elders consistently occupy particular places near the fire. Perhaps children receive their first tools during communal gatherings. These possibilities remain difficult to prove archaeologically, but recurring spatial patterns at several sites imply that behavior around hearths follows recognizable traditions rather than random habit. Over time, those traditions strengthen social cohesion. The fire also encourages generosity because cooking naturally produces visible abundance or scarcity. Everyone sees the day's harvest. Everyone witnesses who contributes fuel, who prepares food, who distributes portions, and who receives assistance during difficult times. Such transparency helps reinforce trust within relatively small communities, where long-term cooperation remains essential. Trust itself becomes a valuable resource. Without it, sharing collapses. Without sharing, survival becomes increasingly uncertain during periods of illness, injury, or environmental hardship. In this way, the hearth quietly supports systems of mutual obligation that later societies expand into more formal institutions. There are, of course, tensions as well. Food shortages occur, hunting fails, storms delay gathering expeditions. Not every evening ends with plenty. Archaeological evidence occasionally reveals periods when communities rely more heavily upon small animals, wild seeds, or other fallback resources. Such changes remind us that life around ancient hearths is never effortless. Adaptation remains constant. Cooperation is tested repeatedly by changing conditions. Yet it is precisely during hardship that the value of gathering together becomes most apparent. A solitary fire warms only one person. A shared fire supports many. Across countless generations, this simple reality shapes habits of cooperation that extend far beyond the meal itself. Around these glowing circles of light, strangers become companions, companions become families, and families slowly become communities, capable of preserving knowledge, adapting to uncertainty, and laying foundations that future civilizations will eventually build upon. The first great cities remain thousands of years away, but the quiet social architecture that makes them possible is already taking shape in the warm light cast by an ordinary evening fire. The fire burns steadily, but it is never alone. Beyond the circle of warmth stretches a landscape that quietly determines whether the flames will return tomorrow next season or for generations yet to come. A hearth can be built almost anywhere, but only certain places invite people to come back again and again. Water must be close enough to reach without exhausting effort. Fuel cannot be too scarce. Animals must pass nearby with some regularity. Wild plants must appear in predictable cycles. Shelter from wind flooding or bitter winter storms becomes just as important as the fire itself. Civilization begins not only because people master the hearth, but because they learn to recognize landscapes that reward staying. To modernize, many of these locations appear surprisingly ordinary. A bend in a river, the edge of a shallow lake, a limestone spring emerging from a hillside, the meeting point of woodland and open grass, a low ridge overlooking a broad valley. None possesses the grandeur associated with famous archaeological monuments. Yet these quiet settings repeatedly attract human communities across thousands of years because they combine resources in ways that reduce uncertainty. They become places where survival requires less chance and more knowledge. Rivers, above all, play an extraordinary role. They provide fresh water, fish, edible reeds, birds, and fertile floodplains. They also serve as natural pathways through otherwise difficult terrain. Following a river often requires less energy than crossing dense forests or steep mountains. Long before roads exist, waterways become the first reliable routes connecting distant landscapes. Ancient hearths appear beside rivers with remarkable frequency. This pattern does not suggest that every early community settles permanently along water, but it does reveal a powerful attraction. A river changes with the seasons swelling after rains and shrinking during dry months, yet its general presence remains dependable. Communities learn its moods. They recognize safe crossing points, productive fishing pools, and elevated ground protected from annual floods. Over time, familiarity grows into confidence. Confidence encourages return. Return strengthens memory. Memory gradually transforms temporary camps into places carrying emotional as well as practical significance. Lakes offer similar advantages. Their shores support rich ecosystems where fish, waterfowl, shellfish, amphibians, and aquatic plants gather within relatively small areas. Larger animals also visit regularly to drink, creating predictable hunting opportunities. During periods of climatic uncertainty, permanent lakes sometimes become lifelines when smaller streams disappear altogether. Archaeological evidence from numerous regions shows repeated occupations clustered around ancient shorelines. Some lakes no longer exist, others have shrunk dramatically. A few lie buried beneath layers of sediment, their former edges reconstructed only through geological investigation. Yet beneath these changing landscapes, hearths remain quietly marking places where generations once returned season after season. Springs possess a different kind of importance. Unlike rivers, whose flow may fluctuate dramatically, springs often emerge with remarkable consistency. Groundwater filtered through layers of rock creates dependable sources of fresh water, even during extended dry periods. In arid and semi-arid environments, especially a reliable spring becomes one of the most valuable features any landscape can offer. Communities quickly learn to protect such places. Animals do the same. The result is a meeting ground where humans, wildlife, and vegetation become closely linked. Hunting becomes more predictable because thirsty animals follow familiar routes. Gathering edible plants becomes easier because moisture supports greater biological diversity. Fuel remains available where trees or shrubs cluster around permanent water. The hearth once again finds a place where many necessities overlap. Yet water alone never explains everything. Fuel presents its own challenges. A thriving fire requires more than occasional branches. Daily cooking, warmth through cold nights, tool making, and food preservation consume remarkable quantities of wood or other combustible material. Communities occupying one location for long periods must understand how surrounding vegetation regenerates. The archaeological record sometimes hints at careful management rather than careless consumption. Instead of stripping nearby forests completely, people likely expand their collection areas gradually or exploit naturally fallen branches. In some treeless environments, dried animal dung reeds, peat, or other fuels supplement scarce wood. Human ingenuity repeatedly adapts to local conditions rather than relying upon a single solution. Scholars continue investigating how early communities balanced fuel needs with environmental sustainability. The evidence remains incomplete because ancient woodland management leaves subtle traces. Even so, charcoal analysis occasionally reveals long-term stability in fuel selection, suggesting that some landscapes support repeated occupation without rapid ecological collapse. Topography quietly shapes settlement as well. A campsite positioned slightly above a floodplain avoids seasonal inundation while remaining close to water. Hillsides exposed to morning sunlight warm earlier after cold nights. Natural rock overhangs reduce the need for elaborate shelters. Valleys protected from strong winds conserve heat more effectively during winter months. Such advantages appear modest individually. Together, however, they create places noticeably easier to inhabit. Generations learn these differences through experience. Children growing up beside one valley understand its rhythms intimately. They recognize where frost lingers longest, where berries ripen first, where dangerous predators prefer to travel, and which slopes remain safest after heavy rain. This intimate environmental knowledge becomes inseparable from the hearth. One without the other loses much of its value. Geology contributes another often overlooked element. Certain landscapes provide high-quality stone suitable for tool-making. Flint-chert obsidian, quartzite, and other materials vary greatly in availability and usefulness. Communities fortunate enough to live near reliable stone sources enjoy significant practical advantages. Broken tools are easily replaced. Hunting equipment remains sharp. Craft traditions become increasingly sophisticated. In several remarkable archaeological sites, hearths sit only short distances from stone outcrops, where generations repeatedly quarry raw material. Waste flakes scattered across the ground reveal centuries of tool production, occurring within easy reach of domestic fires. Obsidian presents an especially fascinating example. Formed through volcanic activity, this naturally occurring volcanic glass fractures into edges sharper than many modern surgical blades. Ancient communities sometimes travel considerable distances to obtain it. Chemical analysis now allows archaeologists to trace obsidian artifacts back to specific volcanic sources, revealing surprisingly extensive networks of movement and exchange, long before formal trade routes emerge. The hearth therefore becomes connected not only to local landscapes but to distant ones as well. Even highly mobile groups gradually establish mental maps extending across hundreds of kilometers. Seasonal journeys link familiar campsites. Knowledge of neighboring valleys accumulates. Encounters with other communities create opportunities for exchanging material skills and perhaps even marriage partners. Settlement, therefore, does not mean isolation. Rather, stable hearths become anchors within broader landscapes of movement. Climate influences every decision. During warmer periods, expanding forests alter hunting opportunities. Cooler conditions shift animal migrations. Changing rainfall transforms grasslands into wetlands or vice versa. Communities respond with remarkable flexibility, relocating when necessary, while often returning whenever conditions improve. This resilience becomes one of humanity's defining characteristics. Instead of forcing environments into rigid patterns, early people generally adapt to changing landscapes with extraordinary sensitivity. Hearths appear, disappear, and reappear according to opportunities presented by climate, water, vegetation, and wildlife. No single path leads towards civilization. Different regions follow different rhythms. In the Fertile Crescent, abundant wild cereals eventually encourage cultivation. Along great African lakes, fishing communities develop unique seasonal traditions. Across European river valleys, forests shape entirely different patterns of movement and settlement. In Eastern Asia, diverse climates produce equally varied adaptations. Yet beneath this diversity lies a shared principle. People return where landscapes consistently reward return. The earth itself quietly teaches permanence. The hearth simply gives that lesson a visible center. Over centuries, repeated occupations gradually alter these favored places. Ash enriches the soil. Discarded shells accumulate into large mounds. Broken tools mark generations of craftsmanship. Trampled pathways connect water to fire shelter, to hunting grounds, gathering places to sleeping areas. Without anyone intending to create lasting monuments, human activity slowly reshapes the landscape into something distinctly cultural. Nature and humanity become intertwined. The valley remains a valley. The river still follows its ancient course. But the ground now carries memories invisible to anyone except those who know where to look. Thousands of years later, archaeologists uncover these quiet transformations and recognize that civilization did not first arise because humans conquered the landscape. It emerged because they learned to belong within it, reading its rhythms with increasing precision and returning season after season to the places where fire, water, memory, and opportunity came together in remarkable balance. The glow from the hearth reaches farther than warmth. As generations pass, its light begins to illuminate activities that have little to do with preparing meals. Stones once carried only for cooking are selected more carefully. Certain rocks fracture cleanly when struck, while others crumble uselessly. Pieces of bone are shaped into fine points instead of being discarded. Sticky tree resins softened over gentle heat suddenly reveal surprising properties. Clay left beside the fire hardens into something far more durable than damp earth. Almost without realizing it, the people gathered around these quiet circles of flame begin turning the hearth into the earliest workshop. Innovation rarely announces itself. There is no moment when someone declares that a new technology has arrived. Instead, countless small observations accumulate over generations. A hunter notices that a wooden spear briefly exposed to heat becomes slightly harder at its tip. Another discovers that resin warmed beside the fire flows into tiny cracks before cooling into a surprisingly strong adhesive. Someone else realizes that cracked stones heated in the flames can continue cooking food long after they are removed from the fire. Each discovery appears modest on its own. Together they quietly transform human capability. Archaeologists increasingly recognize that many technological breakthroughs are inseparable from controlled fire. A hearth provides something difficult to obtain elsewhere: predictable heat. Natural wildfires burn too intensely and too unpredictably. Sunlight alone cannot reach necessary temperatures. Only a carefully tended domestic fire allows repeated experimentation with different materials. This predictability encourages curiosity. A failed experiment does not end the opportunity forever. Tomorrow's fire offers another chance. Stone tools remain among the clearest examples of this gradual refinement. Long before metallurgy changes human history, communities achieve astonishing sophistication using carefully selected stone. Around ancient hearths, archaeologists frequently uncover thousands of tiny flakes produced during tool manufacture. To an untrained eye, these fragments appear to be little more than scattered debris. To specialists, they reveal entire sequences of craftsmanship. The direction of each fracture matters. The angle of each strike leaves subtle clues. An experienced knapper can often reconstruct how a stone core was shaped simply by examining the discarded flakes. Even mistakes become informative. A broken edge shows where too much force was applied. An abandoned core reveals changing decisions made during production. These silent traces preserve the thinking process of artisans who lived thousands of years before writing. The hearth provides ideal conditions for such work. Daylight may be fading, but the fire continues providing enough illumination to finish delicate tasks. Family members preparing food remain nearby while others shape blades, repair hunting equipment, or modify older tools. Work and domestic life become intertwined rather than separated into distinct spaces. Knowledge spreads almost effortlessly under these conditions. Children watching adults handle stone become familiar with techniques long before attempting them independently. They learn which rocks fracture cleanly, how to hold a hammerstone, and why patience often matters more than strength. Such education requires no formal classroom. It unfolds naturally within the daily rhythm of the household. Bone and antler expand technological possibilities even further. Unlike stone, these materials possess a degree of flexibility. They can be carved into needles fine enough to sew animal hides together, fish hooks capable of catching river species, barbed harpoon points, awls for piercing leather, and delicate ornaments requiring careful craftsmanship. Many of these objects demand sustained attention. Their production fits naturally beside the hearth, where warmth softens hands during cold weather and steady light extends productive hours beyond sunset. Some of the most remarkable prehistoric discoveries involve adhesives. Stone blades attached securely to wooden shafts perform far better than simple handheld tools. Creating such composite implements requires binding different materials together. Archaeological evidence from several regions suggests that ancient people develop increasingly sophisticated methods using heated tree resins, plant gums, beeswax mineral powders, and charcoal mixtures. These compounds often require precise preparation. Too much heat ruins them. Too little leaves them ineffective. Controlled fires therefore become essential laboratories where practical chemistry emerges long before anyone possesses scientific language to describe it. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated just how demanding many of these techniques actually are. Researchers attempting to reproduce ancient adhesives often discover that successful mixtures require careful observation and repeated practice. Small differences in temperature dramatically influence the final result. The ancient craftsperson may never understand the molecular processes involved, yet generations of experience produce reliable outcomes nonetheless. Fire also changes color, not the flames themselves, but the materials placed within them. Minerals exposed to heat often shift dramatically in appearance. Certain stones become easier to shape after controlled heating. Ochre pigments deepen into richer shades of red. White ash contrasts sharply with black charcoal. These visual transformations may influence artistic traditions as well as practical ones. Pigments appear with increasing frequency at prehistoric sites associated with repeated occupation. Grinding stones stained with red ochre fragments of colored minerals and decorated objects occasionally emerge from hearth-centered settlements. Scholars continue debating whether such pigments serve symbolic decorative ritual or practical purposes, or perhaps several at once. The evidence remains incomplete. Still, it is difficult to ignore the repeated association between domestic fires and increasingly sophisticated forms of material culture. Textiles leave much poorer archaeological records because fibers decay quickly. Even so, indirect evidence suggests that spinning, twisting, knotting, and weaving gradually become more refined in communities occupying stable settlements. Bone needles, spindle-like tools, impressions preserved in clay, and microscopic fiber residues all hint at expanding knowledge. The hearth again proves invaluable. Plant fibers dry more effectively beside gentle heat. Animal sinew becomes easier to prepare. Hides soften during careful processing. Winter evenings provide extended opportunities for repetitive tasks requiring concentration rather than physical strength. Time itself becomes an important resource. Communities constantly moving across difficult terrain often devote enormous energy simply to transportation. More settled groups still work hard, but repeated use of familiar places reduces certain burdens. Fuel collection follows known routes. Water lies nearby. Shelters require less frequent reconstruction. The hours saved are rarely idle. Instead, they are invested in increasingly specialized activities. Some individuals become particularly skilled toolmakers. Others excel at preparing hides. Still others develop expertise in gathering medicinal plants or producing pigments. True occupational specialization as seen in later civilizations remains far in the future. Nevertheless, the earliest foundations appear here where stable domestic life allows exceptional abilities to develop through repeated practice. Clay perhaps offers the most striking example of accidental innovation. Imagine damp earth dropped beside a fire. The next morning it has hardened. Left close enough to intense heat without crumbling, it becomes unexpectedly durable. No one intends to invent ceramics in a single moment. Rather, countless observations accumulate slowly until someone deliberately shapes wet clay before exposing it to controlled heat. The earliest fired clay objects are often small and simple. Some may be figurines, others may serve practical purposes. Only much later does pottery become widespread in many regions, and even then the timing differs enormously around the world. Scholars emphasize that ceramic technology develops independently in several places rather than spreading from one universal source. Even before pottery becomes common, however, the hearth has already taught humanity an important lesson. Heat can permanently transform matter. This realization eventually leads far beyond clay. Millennia later, controlled furnaces produce copper, bronze, and iron. Glassmaking becomes possible. Lime plaster appears. Bricks harden. The technological revolutions of later civilizations owe an enormous, often overlooked debt to these far earlier experiments beside ordinary domestic fires. Yet perhaps the most profound transformation occurring around the hearth is invisible. Communities begin accumulating practical knowledge at an unprecedented pace. Every generation inherits not only finished tools but improved methods for making them. Mistakes become lessons rather than dead ends. Successes are remembered, repeated, and refined. Innovation no longer depends solely upon isolated inspiration. It becomes cumulative. The workshop surrounding the hearth therefore represents something deeper than technological progress. It demonstrates humanity learning how to preserve improvement itself. Skills no longer vanish completely when an individual dies, because they have already been observed, practiced, and passed onward to others. Civilization grows stronger each time knowledge survives its creators. The quiet fireplace, blackened by smoke and surrounded by scattered flakes of stone, has become more than the center of domestic life. It is now the place where experience is converted into tradition, where experimentation quietly reshapes the material world, and where the earliest foundations of invention begin to burn as steadily as the fire at its heart. The hearth remains in its familiar place, but everything around it begins to change. What was once little more than an open fire beneath the sky gradually becomes enclosed by simple structures. A line of wooden posts interrupts the wind. Branches woven together form temporary walls. Animal hides stretch across light frames. In colder regions, heavy bones from large mammals support coverings thick enough to withstand long winters. None of these buildings resemble the houses of later civilizations, yet they represent something equally significant. Human beings are no longer simply visiting the landscape. They're beginning to shape spaces intended to be lived in. These early shelters rarely survive the passing of millennia. Wood decays, leather rots, reeds collapse into the soil. Grass roofs disappear almost completely. What remains are faint stains where posts once stood, subtle depressions marking old floors, concentrations of discarded tools, and most consistently of all the hearth itself. The fire becomes the fixed point around which everything else is organized. When archaeologists uncover these ancient settlements, the houses often appear only after careful mapping. Dark circles reveal the locations of wooden support posts. Thin bands of compacted earth outline walls that vanished thousands of years earlier. Slight differences in soil texture indicate where people repeatedly walked, slept, worked, or discarded refuse. The buildings themselves have disappeared, but their invisible footprints remain. At the center of many of these patterns lies the same quiet feature: a fireplace. Sometimes it occupies the middle of the structure. Sometimes it rests slightly off-center to improve ventilation. Occasionally several hearths appear within a larger settlement, each serving a different household. These arrangements reveal something important. Domestic life is no longer organized only around temporary camps. It is beginning to develop recognizable spaces with distinct purposes. A home, even in its earliest form, creates order. Sleeping areas remain cleaner than cooking spaces. Food preparation occurs close to the fire. Stoneworking may shift toward the edges to reduce dangerous fragments beneath bare feet. Refuse accumulates beyond the main living area. These decisions are practical, yet together they establish habits of organization that later become fundamental to village life. Scholars still debate how permanent many of these early dwellings truly are. Some may stand for only a season before being abandoned. Others are repaired repeatedly over many years. In several remarkable archaeological sites, new structures are erected directly atop older ones generation after generation. This continuity suggests that particular locations hold lasting importance beyond immediate convenience. People are not merely rebuilding, they are returning to familiar ground. The reasons vary from place to place. In one valley, reliable fishing supports long occupations. Elsewhere, abundant game encourages repeated settlement. Some regions offer rich stands of edible plants that mature predictably every year. Others provide ideal access to high-quality stone, clay, or timber. Different landscapes encourage different patterns, but all share a common thread. The hearth becomes increasingly connected to a place that people think of as their own. Ownership, however, is still a complicated idea. The archaeological record offers little evidence that early communities think in terms of private property, as later agricultural societies often do. Land is more likely understood through use familiarity, seasonal rites, and shared tradition than through rigid boundaries. Nevertheless, repeated occupation creates growing attachment. A particular spring is known. A particular grove is remembered. A particular shelter becomes associated with generations of family life. The emotional geography of humanity begins expanding alongside its physical settlements. Children play an especially important role in this transformation. In highly mobile communities, they experience constant movement and adaptation from infancy. In more settled environments, they also develop deep familiarity with one place. They know which tree provides the best climbing branches, where birds build nests each spring, which stones become warm first after sunrise, and where elders prefer to sit beside the evening fire. Memory becomes rooted in location. Each generation inherits not only practical knowledge but emotional landscapes shaped by countless ordinary experiences. The hearth strengthens these connections every day. It marks birthdays never formally counted. It witnesses recoveries from illness. It warms newborn children during their first winters. It remains burning while elders reach the ends of their long lives. Although prehistoric societies leave no written family histories, the continuity of domestic spaces suggests that memories accumulate around familiar fires in ways difficult to measure archaeologically. Some settlements reveal signs of remarkable planning. Rather than scattered shelters placed randomly across open-ground houses begin following loose patterns. Pathways emerge naturally between them. Shared activity areas occupy central spaces. Storage pits appear nearby. Water collection routes become well established. No architect designs these layouts. Instead, they evolve gradually through repeated use. The result is an organic form of planning that responds directly to everyday needs. One family builds where morning sunlight reaches earliest. Another remains close to the spring. A third positions its shelter where prevailing winds carry smoke away from sleeping areas. Over time, these individual decisions combine into recognizable communities. The spaces between homes become increasingly meaningful. Children move freely from one hearth to another. Adults cooperate during food preparation or tool-making. Information travels quickly through settlements where daily interaction becomes routine. Neighbors begin depending upon one another more consistently than isolated camps ever require. This growing interdependence strengthens resilience. If one hunting party returns empty-handed, another may have enjoyed success. If illness prevents one household from collecting fuel nearby, families can assist. The village, though still small by later standards, becomes more reliable than any single household standing alone. Archaeologists occasionally discover storage pits close to these early homes. Some contain preserved seeds. Others hold nuts, dried foods, or carefully selected raw materials. The appearance of storage marks another subtle but profound shift in human thinking. Resources are no longer viewed only in terms of immediate consumption. Communities increasingly prepare for seasons yet to come. Planning extends across months rather than days. This does not mean uncertainty disappears. Far from it. Droughts still occur. Animals alter migration routes. Floods damage settlements. Harsh winters test every community. Yet the existence of stored food, repaired shelters, and familiar neighbors greatly improves the chances of surviving difficult years. The home becomes a place of security as much as shelter. Dogs may also become increasingly visible within these settlements. The domestication of wolves into early dogs unfolds over long periods and remains an active field of research. Scholars continue debating aspects of its timing and regional variation. Even so, archaeological evidence demonstrates that dogs accompany many prehistoric communities long before cities or kingdoms emerge. Around the hearth, they likely serve several roles. They help during hunts. They alert people to approaching predators or strangers. They consume food scraps that might otherwise attract scavengers. Perhaps just as importantly, they become companions within the domestic world taking shape around the fire. Their presence subtly changes the rhythm of household life. Night itself begins to feel different. Shelters retain warmth longer than open camps. Smoke drifting through roof openings discourages insects. Families sleep closer together. The sounds of rain striking woven roofs replace exposure to open skies. Storms remain dangerous, but they become experiences endured from within a protected space rather than beneath the full force of the elements. Architecture, however simple, alters psychology. It creates an inside and an outside. The distinction seems obvious today, yet it represents a profound cultural development. Within these early homes, people begin defining spaces not only by geography but by belonging. Outside lies the wider landscape with all its opportunities and risks. Inside gathers family memory tools, food warmth, and shared experience. The hearth binds both worlds together. Its smoke rises toward the sky while its embers remain rooted in the earth. From this quiet center, the earliest households slowly evolve into neighborhoods, the neighborhoods into villages, and eventually, though still unimaginably far in the future, villages into the first towns. Long before stone walls or grand temples dominate the horizon, civilization learns one of its most enduring lessons, that lasting communities are built not from monuments, but from countless homes, where ordinary lives unfold around a fire that welcomes people back day after day, year after year. The hearth still burns at the center of daily life, but something subtle has begun to change in the baskets resting nearby. They're no longer filled only with whatever the landscape happens to provide on a particular day. Some contain seeds gathered weeks earlier. Others hold nuts carefully dried to last through winter. Bundles of grasses lean against shelter walls instead of being consumed immediately. These small acts of saving, rather than simply collecting, represent one of the quietest revolutions in human history. Long before neatly planted fields stretch across the horizon, the relationship between people and plants is already beginning to shift. For hundreds of thousands of years, human communities depend primarily on landscapes that renew themselves naturally. They follow ripening fruits, seasonal roots, migrating animals, shellfish exposed by changing tides, and countless other resources whose cycles are shaped by climate rather than human intention. This way of life proves remarkably successful for an extraordinarily long time. Archaeologists increasingly emphasize that hunter-gatherer societies are neither primitive nor unsuccessful. Many possess sophisticated environmental knowledge refined over thousands of generations, yet familiarity with particular landscapes gradually encourages a different kind of observation. People notice where edible plants appear year after year. They remember which patches produce the largest grains. They recognize that disturbed soil often encourages fresh growth. They observe that seeds dropped accidentally near camps sometimes sprout in surprising abundance. None of these discoveries immediately produces agriculture. Instead, they accumulate slowly, almost imperceptibly, through repeated experience beside the same hearths. Scholars continue debating exactly how farming first emerges, because no single explanation fits every region. Agriculture develops independently in several parts of the world, separated by thousands of kilometers and often thousands of years. Wheat and barley are domesticated in Southwest Asia. Rice follows a different path in East Asia. Millet, maize, potatoes, sorghum, yams, beans, squash, and numerous other crops each possess unique histories shaped by local climates, native plants, and human traditions. There is no universal invention of farming. There are many beginnings. Even so, nearly all share one common feature. They grow from communities already deeply familiar with particular landscapes. The hearth plays a surprisingly important role in this gradual transformation. Cooking reveals differences among plants that might otherwise go unnoticed. Some grains become sweeter after roasting. Certain roots soften only after prolonged heating. Others remain bitter unless carefully prepared. Repeated experimentation beside domestic fires teaches generations which plants deserve further attention. The fire also creates ash. To modern gardeners, wood ash is recognized as a source of minerals that can enrich certain soils when used appropriately. Ancient communities almost certainly do not understand the underlying chemistry, but they cannot fail to notice that vegetation often grows vigorously in places where fires have repeatedly burned. The evidence remains incomplete regarding how intentionally early people exploited this effect, yet archaeologists increasingly investigate whether long-used camps subtly altered surrounding ecosystems in ways that favored useful plants. Even simple habits contribute to environmental change. Seeds spill during food preparation. Fruit pits are discarded. Animal waste accumulates. Ash mixes with soil. Footpaths disturb competing vegetation. Over years and generations, the immediate surroundings of settlements become ecologically distinct from untouched landscapes. Some researchers describe these areas as early forms of human-shaped environments rather than purely natural ones. The transformation remains gradual. No fences appear overnight. No vast cultivated fields suddenly replace forests. Instead, people begin influencing local plant communities almost without realizing it. Storage becomes increasingly significant as well. Once communities occupy familiar places for longer periods, preserving food gains obvious advantages. Wild grains collected during a brief harvest season can sustain people months later, if protected from moisture and pests. Nuts gathered in abundance become valuable winter reserves. Dried berries, smoked fish, and preserved meat reduce the uncertainty that once accompanied every changing season. Archaeological evidence occasionally reveals carefully constructed storage pits lined with stone clay bark or woven plant material. These underground spaces help maintain stable temperatures while protecting valuable food supplies. Storage changes more than survival. It changes thought itself. Planning begins extending further into the future. People harvest not only for today but for seasons yet unseen. This shift encourages increasingly careful observation of annual cycles. When exactly do particular grasses mature? Which valleys ripen first? How long can different foods remain edible? Which methods of drying produce the best results? Each answer strengthens the connection between community and landscape. The hearth remains where much of this knowledge is shared. Evening meals become opportunities to compare harvests from different locations. Older members remember years of abundance and years of scarcity. Children learn that certain plants should never be gathered too early, while others become dangerous if left too long. Time itself acquires a more seasonal rhythm. Instead of responding only to immediate opportunities, communities begin anticipating predictable events months in advance. Climate continues shaping every decision. A few unusually wet years may encourage abundant growth of wild cereals. Extended drought can produce entirely different strategies. No single environmental condition inevitably leads toward cultivation. Rather, local circumstances interact with generations of accumulated knowledge. This complexity explains why agriculture appears at different times across the globe. Some rich environments support highly successful hunter-gatherer societies for thousands of years without widespread farming. Elsewhere, cultivation gradually becomes increasingly attractive as populations grow or climates shift. The archaeological record preserves fascinating hints of this long transition. Grinding stones become more common in certain regions. Their surfaces bear microscopic polish created by processing grains repeatedly over many years. Residues trapped within their rough textures reveal starches from wild cereals, legumes, roots, and tubers. The tools themselves become heavier. Unlike portable implements carried across great distances, these grinding stones often remain close to the hearth, because their weight makes frequent transport impractical. Once again, staying in one place encourages technological change. Communities also begin investing greater effort in protecting valuable food sources, although clear evidence for organized fields remains limited during the earlier stages. Some researchers believe people remove competing vegetation around favored plants or encourage naturally productive patches through selective harvesting. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars debate how intentional many of these practices truly are. Nevertheless, human influence upon local ecosystems steadily increases. Animals notice these changes too. Rodents are attracted by stored grain. Birds gather where seeds accumulate. Larger herbivores browse near patches of especially vigorous vegetation. Predators follow prey. The settlement becomes a new ecological center influencing many species simultaneously. Human history and natural history grow increasingly intertwined. Domesticated animals eventually enter this changing world. Dogs have already become companions in many regions. Later sheep-goats, pigs and cattle, gradually join human communities through complex domestication processes unfolding across generations. Each species follows its own path. Some are initially hunted before being managed. Others adapt gradually to living near human settlements where food remains available. The hearth once again serves as the center around which these relationships develop. Cooking scraps feed animals. Warmth attracts them during cold weather. People observe their behavior closely. Trust grows slowly. The distinction between wild and domestic becomes less absolute. Meanwhile, population slowly increases. More reliable food supplies support more children surviving into adulthood. Larger communities require greater cooperation. Households become increasingly interconnected through exchange, shared labor, and mutual dependence. The quiet circles of fire that once supported only small family groups now anchor settlements whose rhythms are becoming more complex with every passing generation. Yet uncertainty never disappears. Harvests fail. Floods destroy stored food. Insects consume valuable reserves. Unexpected frosts damage fragile plants. Communities remain vulnerable to forces beyond human control. Perhaps this uncertainty explains why flexibility continues to matter so much. Many early farming societies still hunt fish and gather extensively. Agriculture supplements older traditions rather than replacing them overnight. Civilization does not abandon its past. It builds upon it. The ancient hearth reflects this continuity perfectly. The same fire that once roasted wild game now cooks early cultivated grains. The same stones that warmed wandering hunters now support families returning to familiar homes. The same shared meals continue teaching cooperation even as the ingredients slowly change. The revolution unfolding beside these quiet fires is therefore neither sudden nor dramatic. It is patient, measured in generations rather than years, invisible to those living through it. Yet from these careful experiments with seeds, storage seasons, and settled life, emerges one of humanity's most enduring transformations. Without proclamation or grand design, the first foundations of agriculture take root beside ordinary hearths, preparing the way for villages that will one day feed cities, kingdoms, and civilizations still beyond the distant horizon. The hearth continues to burn as it always has, providing warmth, light, and food. Yet over countless generations another kind of fire begins to take shape beside it, one that cannot be measured by temperature alone. Certain places around the flames are treated with unusual care. Particular objects are placed nearby rather than discarded with ordinary refuse. A handful of red ochre appears where practical necessity alone cannot fully explain its presence. The remains of loved ones are sometimes laid to rest within sight of the homes they once shared. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the hearth becomes more than the center of domestic life. It begins to occupy a place within humanity's spiritual imagination. This transformation leaves only faint traces in the archaeological record. Beliefs do not fossilize. Prayers leave no imprint in stone. Stories about ancestors disappear with the voices that tell them. For this reason, archaeologists approach questions of prehistoric religion with great caution. Scholars still debate the meaning of many discoveries, because material evidence rarely reveals exactly what people believed. A carefully arranged burial may reflect spiritual conviction, practical custom, family affection, or several motivations at once. No single explanation fully accounts for every site. Even so, patterns emerge. Across many regions and time periods, hearths repeatedly appear close to activities suggesting that domestic life and symbolic thought are becoming increasingly intertwined. One of the clearest examples comes from burial practices. For much of early human history, the dead are not always separated from the places where the living continue their daily routines. At several prehistoric sites, burials occur beneath house floors, beside dwellings, or within settlements, rather than in distant cemeteries. These discoveries hint that the boundary between the living household and remembered ancestors is blurring. They suggest that the may have been far less distinct than it often is today. Imagine a family returning each evening to the same hearth. The fire is familiar. The surrounding landscape is familiar. Beneath the floor nearby rests someone who once sat beside those same flames. Whether understood through spiritual belief, family memory, or simple continuity, the presence of the dead becomes part of everyday existence. Children grow up knowing that previous generations remain connected to the place they call home. The archaeological evidence cannot tell us exactly how they understood this relationship, but it strongly suggests that memory itself becomes rooted in domestic space. Red ochre appears again and again within this context. This naturally occurring iron-rich pigment has fascinated archaeologists for generations. It is found at sites stretching back tens of thousands of years, and often appears in association with burials, decorated objects, or places of repeated occupation. Its exact significance remains uncertain. Some scholars interpret it as symbolic, perhaps representing blood-life renewal or transformation. Others emphasize practical uses, noting that ochre can function as a preservative hide treatment, sunscreen, or insect repellent. These possibilities are not mutually exclusive. A material valued for practical reasons can also acquire profound symbolic meaning over time. Whatever its purpose, the repeated appearance of ochre near hearth-centered communities suggests that fire color and memory increasingly occupy shared cultural space. Certain objects also seem to resist ordinary disposal. Broken tools are often discarded without ceremony, yet occasionally archaeologists uncover carefully placed artifacts whose positions suggest deliberate treatment. Animal skulls appear arranged in unusual ways. Decorated stones remain beside hearths. Special objects accompany burials rather than everyday refuse. The evidence remains incomplete and interpretation demands caution. Nevertheless, repeated patterns across widely separated regions imply that people are beginning to distinguish between ordinary possessions and objects carrying deeper significance. The hearth provides a natural setting for such distinctions. It already represents continuity. The same fire is rekindled day after day. Meals unite families. Stories preserve memory. Life unfolds in repeated cycles. It is hardly surprising that symbolic traditions also begin gathering around this familiar center. Seasonality may strengthen these beliefs. Communities living in one place long enough witness the landscape changing through complete annual cycles. Winter strips trees bare. Spring restores them. Animals migrate away and then return. Rivers rise and fall. Seeds disappear beneath the soil before emerging months later. Death and renewal become visible everywhere. Repeated observation encourages reflection. The rhythm of nature becomes inseparable from the rhythm of human life. The hearth mirrors these cycles. Its fire dies each night only to be rekindled at dawn. Ash accumulates from yesterday's flames, nourishing tomorrow's fire. Perhaps such daily experiences quietly shape broader understandings of continuity, loss, and renewal. No archaeological discovery can prove this directly, yet the parallels are difficult to ignore. Ancestor memory likely grows stronger as settlements become more permanent. Highly mobile groups certainly remember previous generations, but communities returning repeatedly to the same homes possess physical reminders unavailable to constantly moving populations. The hearth itself becomes an heirloom. Its stones are blackened by decades of smoke. Children watch parents tending the same fire once cared for by grandparents. Knowledge passes not merely through words, but through familiar actions repeated in familiar places. This continuity creates powerful emotional attachment. Anthropologists studying traditional societies have often observed that domestic fires symbolize family identity as much as practical necessity. While direct comparison with prehistoric peoples must always remain cautious, such observations suggest how ordinary household routines can acquire profound cultural importance over long periods. Fire itself inspires reflection. Unlike stone or water, flames are alive with movement. They consume yet create. They destroy yet protect. They demand care. Left untended, they vanish. Allowed to spread unchecked, they become dangerous. Maintaining balance requires constant attention. Perhaps this very unpredictability contributes to the symbolic importance of fire across many later civilizations. The archaeological record cannot reveal exactly when such meanings first emerge. It does show, however, that humanity's long relationship with controlled fire provides countless opportunities for symbolic interpretation. Certain animals also appear to occupy special positions within prehistoric thought. At some sites, particular species receive treatment different from ordinary food waste. Bird feathers, antlers, predator teeth shells carried from distant coasts and unusual fossils sometimes appear within settlements far from their natural sources. These items may simply reflect aesthetic appreciation. They may indicate exchange networks. They may carry ritual significance. Scholars continue debating each case individually. Yet together they reveal an expanding cultural world where objects possess meanings extending beyond immediate survival. Music may also have found a place beside the hearth. Bone flutes dating back tens of thousands of years demonstrate remarkable craftsmanship. Percussion requires little more than wood stone or stretched hide. Songs, of course, leave no archaeological trace. Still, it is difficult to imagine evenings around enduring fires remaining entirely silent. Rhythm memory and communal identity likely reinforce one another through repeated performances, whose echoes disappeared long before history was written. The fire becomes a stage without walls. Stories preserve ancestors. Music strengthens belonging. Shared rituals mark births, partnerships, deaths, seasonal changes and successful hunts. Most of these traditions remain forever beyond direct archaeological recovery, yet their influence may be visible indirectly through the remarkable stability of many long-lived communities. People return not only because the landscape provides food, they return because it is home. Home itself has become sacred in ways impossible to measure. The hearth stands at the center of this transformation. It witnesses grief and celebration alike. It warms newborn infants and elderly hands. It burns during ordinary meals and extraordinary moments. Generation after generation, the same simple fire gathers experiences that gradually become tradition. Long before temples rise above city skylines or priests record formal ceremonies, humanity is already weaving memory, identity, and belief into everyday domestic life. Civilization's spiritual foundations are therefore not born first inside monumental sanctuaries. They begin quietly beside familiar hearths where ordinary families discover that the places sustaining life also preserve remembrance, and where the warmth of shared fire slowly becomes inseparable from the enduring presence of those who came before. The circle of homes surrounding familiar hearths no longer feels temporary. Seasons still pass, rivers still rise and fall, and hunting trails still stretch across distant hills. Yet the settlement itself begins to possess a permanence that earlier generations rarely experience. More children survive into adulthood. More families build their lives within walking distance of one another. The smoke rising each morning no longer comes from a single fire, but from many drifting upward together before dissolving into the same sky. Without anyone planning a town, something remarkably similar begins to emerge. Growth brings opportunity. It also brings problems that small communities seldom face. When only a handful of families share a landscape, disagreements can often be settled through personal relationships. Everyone knows one another intimately. Resources are gathered collectively and decisions arise through long familiarity. As settlements expand, however, daily life becomes more complicated. More people require more food. More shelters compete for space. More children mean more mouths to feed, more fuel to gather, and greater pressure on nearby forests, rivers, and hunting grounds. The hearth remains unchanged. The community surrounding it does not. Archaeologists frequently observe that larger settlements display increasing signs of organization. Houses become arranged with greater consistency. Open spaces appear between clusters of dwellings, perhaps serving as communal areas where food is prepared. Collectively, tools are exchanged or seasonal gatherings take place. Footpaths worn by countless generations gradually become recognizable routes, connecting homes, water sources, storage areas, and neighboring settlements. No surveyor measures these paths. No engineer designs them. Instead, thousands of ordinary journeys gradually shape the landscape. People naturally choose the easiest routes. Children follow adults. Neighbors visit one another daily. Repeated movement presses vegetation into narrow trails that slowly become permanent features of the settlement. The ground itself begins remembering where people belong. With increasing population comes increasing specialization. Although nearly everyone still participates in obtaining food, certain individuals become particularly skilled at specific tasks. One person consistently shapes the finest stone blades. Another produces exceptionally durable baskets. Someone else understands the behavior of local animals better than anyone nearby. Certain families become known for preparing hides, crafting ornaments, or locating valuable raw materials from distant hills. These abilities do not yet create formal professions. They do, however, encourage exchange. Instead of every household producing everything equally well, communities begin relying upon one another's strengths. Trust deepens through repeated cooperation. Reciprocity becomes increasingly important. A skilled toolmaker may receive food from successful hunters. Gatherers share seasonal harvests with families occupied in repairing shelters. Knowledge becomes another valuable resource exchanged between households. The hearth once again serves as the place where much of this interaction unfolds. Evening fires become gathering places not only for immediate family, but for neighbors whose skills complement one another. Ideas spread rapidly under such conditions. A new method of shaping stone introduced in one household gradually appears throughout the settlement. Improved storage techniques become common. Successful approaches to preserving food or constructing shelters spread through observation rather than formal instruction. Innovation becomes social. The archaeological record occasionally captures these transformations with surprising clarity. At some prehistoric villages, houses remain remarkably similar in size and construction, suggesting relatively equal access to resources. Elsewhere, subtle differences begin emerging. Certain dwellings contain larger storage areas. Others possess unusually rich collections of tools or ornaments. These variations hint at increasing social complexity, although scholars remain careful not to exaggerate their significance. Inequality where it appears develops gradually. It rarely arrives as a sudden revolution. Control over valuable resources may contribute to these changes. A family living closest to a reliable spring enjoys certain advantages during dry seasons. Those with access to particularly fertile land may produce larger harvests. Communities situated near important stone sources attract visitors seeking raw materials. Exchange networks become more active, connecting settlements separated by considerable distances. Archaeologists trace some of these networks through remarkable discoveries. Obsidian from a specific volcanic source may appear hundreds of kilometers away. Marine shells travel far inland. Decorative stones move across mountain ranges. Pigments unavailable locally emerge within distant communities. These objects reveal something profound. People are no longer living in isolated worlds. Communication extends well beyond the horizon. The hearth anchors local life, but human curiosity reaches outward. Trade, however informal, does more than move objects. It carries ideas. New techniques for shaping tools spread alongside valuable stone. Different methods of constructing shelters accompany seasonal visitors. Plant knowledge, hunting strategies, decorative traditions, and perhaps even stories pass from community to community. Civilization grows not only through invention but through exchange. Population growth also changes humanity's relationship with the surrounding environment. Nearby forests experience greater demand for fuel. Hunting territories expand. Fishing becomes more intensive. Wild plant harvesting follows increasingly organized patterns. Some communities begin consciously managing resources to prevent depletion. Others relocate temporarily when local supplies diminish. The evidence remains incomplete and regional differences remain substantial. Still, archaeologists increasingly recognize that environmental stewardship becomes an important challenge long before written history begins. Not every settlement succeeds. Some grow too quickly. Others exhaust nearby resources. Climate shifts unexpectedly. Floods alter river courses. Droughts reduce harvests. Disease may spread more easily among larger populations living in closer proximity. Growth therefore creates vulnerability as well as strength. The balance remains delicate. Leadership likely evolves during this period as well. Formal kingship remains far in the future for most communities, yet decisions affecting many households require coordination. Seasonal hunting, conflict resolution, resource distribution, and responses to environmental crises all demand some degree of collective organization. Exactly how these decisions are made remains uncertain. Some communities may rely primarily upon respected elders. Others may emphasize skilled hunters, experienced gatherers, or individuals possessing unusual knowledge. Leadership probably varies enormously across different cultures and environments. No single model fits every prehistoric settlement. What survives in the archaeological record suggests diversity rather than uniformity. Children growing up in these expanding villages experience a world very different from that of their distant ancestors. Instead of knowing only one or two family fires, they see dozens. Playmates come from neighboring households. Skills are learned from many adults rather than exclusively from parents. Festivals marking seasonal events may involve entire communities. Identity gradually expands beyond immediate kinship. People begin belonging not only to families but to villages. This psychological shift may prove as important as any technological innovation. Communities now possess collective memories. The settlement itself acquires history. Certain trees are remembered because grandparents planted them. Old hearths mark the homes of previous generations. Stories become attached not merely to landscapes but to specific places within those landscapes. Memory grows increasingly communal. The physical appearance of the village reflects this accumulated history. New houses stand beside rebuilt older ones. Storage pits are reopened year after year. Footpaths deepen. Ash layers thicken beneath ancient hearths. The ground beneath every step contains traces of countless ordinary lives. Without intending to create monuments, people build something perhaps even more enduring. They create continuity. This continuity quietly prepares humanity for transformations still unimaginable. Larger populations support more experimentation. Reliable exchange encourages broader cooperation. Shared traditions strengthen social cohesion. Knowledge accumulates faster than before because more minds contribute to collective experience. The village becomes a living archive where each generation inherits not only tools and shelters, but increasingly sophisticated ways of organizing life itself. The hearth remains at the center of every home, yet beyond its familiar warmth. Another kind of fire has begun spreading across the settlement. It is the fire of cooperation on a larger scale of shared memory, extending beyond family and of communities learning that their greatest strength no longer lies solely in surviving together for one season, but in building a future that stretches across generations. Within these growing villages lie the first unmistakable outlines of societies that will one day give rise to towns, cities, kingdoms, and civilizations, whose achievements begin with these quiet gatherings around ordinary household fires. For generations, the fires have burned almost without interruption. Their smoke has drifted above rivers, valleys, forests, and open grasslands through countless seasons. Children have become elders beside them. Shelters have been rebuilt where older shelters once stood. Seeds have been planted, harvested, and stored. Villages have slowly expanded until the rhythm of settled life begins to feel almost permanent. Yet permanence is one of history's greatest illusions. The same landscapes that patiently nurture communities can also change with astonishing force. A river that faithfully supplies fresh water for centuries may suddenly abandon its channel after a series of powerful floods. A spring that never seems to fail can slowly weaken as regional rainfall declines. Forests retreat under changing temperatures. Herds alter ancient migration routes. Winds carry unfamiliar dust across fields that once remained fertile. None of these transformations announces itself in a single dramatic moment. More often they begin so gradually that one generation barely notices them while the next quietly realizes that something essential has been lost. The hearth is often the first place where these changes become impossible to ignore. Each morning someone must walk farther to gather firewood. Each season hunting parties return with slightly less game. The baskets filled with grain no longer seem quite as heavy. Water must be fetched from more distant sources. No individual hardship appears catastrophic by itself. Together, however, they slowly reshape the life of an entire settlement. Climate has always guided human history. Long before written records describe droughts or flood shifts in rainfall temperature and seasonal predictability influence where people can live successfully. Archaeologists and paleoclimatologists now reconstruct many of these ancient environmental changes using lake sediments, cave formations, pollen records, tree rings, and ice cores. Although no single source tells the complete story together, they reveal that prehistoric communities often experience centuries of remarkable stability followed by periods of profound uncertainty. One of the greatest challenges lies in recognizing slow disasters. An earthquake destroys buildings within moments. A volcanic eruption transforms landscapes in days. Climate change often unfolds across decades or generations. The people living through it rarely witness a clear beginning or end. Instead, they adapt continuously until adaptation itself becomes increasingly difficult. The archaeological record preserves this struggle in subtle ways. Storage pits gradually become larger, suggesting greater concern for uncertain harvests. Animal bones reveal changing diets as communities rely upon smaller species after larger game becomes less available. Charcoal analysis sometimes indicates that people burn different kinds of wood because preferred trees have become scarce nearby. Even the size and location of settlements begin shifting. Some villages shrink, others are abandoned altogether. New communities emerge in more favorable regions. These movements are rarely random. People follow opportunity. When one landscape can no longer support growing populations, another becomes more attractive. Migration has accompanied humanity since its earliest origins, and settled life does not end that pattern. The difference is emotional. Leaving a temporary camp differs greatly from abandoning a home occupied by generations. Imagine extinguishing a hearth that has burned for decades. Its stones are blackened by familiar smoke. Children born beside its warmth are now parents themselves. Nearby lie the graves of ancestors. The surrounding fields, forests, and streams are woven into memory. Walking away means leaving more than a shelter. It means leaving part of a shared identity. Archaeologists occasionally encounter settlements that seem to capture this difficult moment. The evidence suggests orderly departure rather than violent destruction. Valuable tools are taken. Useful materials disappear. Only heavy grinding stones, damaged objects, and traces too cumbersome to carry remain behind. The houses gradually collapse. Wind scatters ash across abandoned floors. Grass grows where children once played. Years later, travelers may pass without realizing that an entire community once flourished there. Nature slowly reclaims the village. Elsewhere, abandonment appears less orderly. Flood deposits bury domestic floors beneath thick layers of silt. Drought leaves once productive landscapes covered in drifting sand. Coastal settlements disappear beneath rising seas or eroding shorelines. River channels shift away, leaving former villages stranded far from dependable water. Each case reflects different circumstances. No single explanation fully accounts for every abandoned settlement. Sometimes several pressures combine. Environmental stress weakens food supplies. Population continues growing. Competition for resources increases. Conflict becomes more likely. Disease spreads more easily among communities already facing nutritional hardship. The result is not a single catastrophic event, but a gradual unraveling of stability. The hearth quietly records these changes. Ash layers become thinner as occupation becomes less regular. Repair work on shelters grows less frequent. Storage facilities are left partially empty. In some sites, fireplaces simply stop being rebuilt. The final fire burns. No one rekindles it. Centuries pass before another human hand touches those stones again. Yet decline is never the whole story. Abandonment in one place often creates opportunity elsewhere. Communities carry their knowledge with them. Seeds are transported. Stoneworking traditions continue. Stories survive. Children raised in one valley become the founders of settlements in another. The physical village disappears, but its culture often endures through migration. This continuity explains why archaeologists rarely view abandonment as simple failure. Human societies prove remarkably resilient. When environments change, people usually attempt adaptation before surrender. They alter diets. They modify hunting strategies. They experiment with different crops. They strengthen exchange with neighboring communities. Only when these efforts become insufficient do larger movements begin. Even then, knowledge travels with them. Some of history's greatest civilizations are built by people whose ancestors once abandoned earlier homes. The archaeological record also reveals remarkable recoveries. Certain settlements lie empty for centuries before new populations arrive. The newcomers sometimes build directly atop older foundations, perhaps unaware of those who lived there before. In other cases, ancient hearths remain visible enough to attract renewed occupation. Reliable water still flows. The landscape remains favorable. Time has erased previous buildings, but not the underlying advantages of the location itself. The earth patiently waits for another generation. Scholars continue debating the precise role climate plays in these long-term cycles. Some emphasize environmental change as the primary driver. Others argue that social organization, trade innovation, and cultural flexibility often matter just as much. The evidence suggests a complex interaction rather than a single cause. Communities facing similar environmental pressures sometimes respond very differently. One village disappears, another adapts successfully. A third relocates while preserving its traditions. Human choice remains part of the story. The abandoned hearth therefore becomes one of archaeology's most moving discoveries. It represents neither victory nor defeat. It captures a moment suspended between continuity and change. The final meal has long since vanished. The people who tended the fire have walked beyond the horizon. Yet beneath the ash remain tiny fragments of charcoal, cracked stones, scattered seeds and broken bones, quiet reminders that ordinary lives once unfolded here with hopes, no different from those of generations before or after. Civilization does not advance in a straight line. It grows, pauses, adapts, retreats, and begins again. The fires that once warmed these forgotten homes eventually go dark, but they are never truly extinguished. Their knowledge travels with those who leave their memory lingers in the landscape, and their influence quietly shapes the communities that rise elsewhere. Even in silence, abandoned hearths continue telling one of humanity's oldest stories that survival has never depended upon staying forever in one place, but upon carrying the lessons of home wherever the next fire is lit. For much of human history, the ancient hearth remains hidden beneath layers of soil, unnoticed by everyone who walks above it. Forests spread where villages once stood. Rivers change course, depositing fresh sediment over abandoned homes. Grasslands swallow old pathways. New civilizations rise and fall without realizing they're building atop the quiet remains of people who solved many of the same problems thousands of years earlier. Time buries almost everything, yet it never buries it completely. The rediscovery begins not with dramatic treasure hunts, but with careful observation. A farmer turning a field notices an unusual concentration of dark soil, unlike the surrounding earth. Construction workers uncover a scatter of blackened stones while digging foundations for a modern road. Heavy rains expose fragments of charcoal along an eroding riverbank. Sometimes archaeologists identify promising locations from the air, where subtle differences in vegetation reveal traces of structures hidden beneath the surface. Increasingly, satellites, drones, and laser-based technologies detect ancient settlements concealed beneath forests, deserts, and farmland without disturbing the ground at all. The first indication of an ancient hearth is often surprisingly modest. Instead of gleaming artifacts or towering ruins, researchers encounter a patch of earth stained darker than its surroundings. Centuries of repeated burning leave behind charcoal particles so fine that they permanently alter the soil. What appears insignificant to an untrained eye immediately attracts attention from experienced archaeologists. Excavation begins slowly. Modern archaeology values information far more than speed. Every layer removed can never be replaced, making excavation an irreversible act. For this reason, researchers document everything before lifting a single object. Precise measurements record the location of every stone, bone, fragment, seed, and tool. High-resolution photography captures each stage of excavation. Increasingly sophisticated three-dimensional scanning preserves digital models that allow future researchers to revisit the site virtually long after excavation is complete. The goal is not simply to discover objects, it is to reconstruct lives. Every fragment contributes to that reconstruction. A piece of charcoal becomes valuable not because it is visually impressive, but because it can be dated. Burned seeds reveal seasonal activities. Tiny fish bones suggest nearby waterways or particular fishing techniques. Cracked stones indicate repeated heating and cooling. Even insect remains preserved within ancient sediments provide clues about local climate and environmental conditions. Modern laboratories have transformed what archaeologists can learn from these seemingly ordinary materials. Microscopic analysis reveals plant species invisible to the naked eye. Chemical testing identifies residues from ancient meals absorbed into pottery or stone surfaces. Isotopic studies determine where certain animals grazed before being hunted. Ancient DNA, extracted from bones, teeth, and occasionally sediments, reveals relationships among human populations and even traces of long-extinct species. Perhaps one of the most remarkable developments comes from environmental DNA. Living organisms constantly shed microscopic genetic material into their surroundings. Under favorable conditions, traces of this DNA survive within ancient sediments for thousands of years. Researchers can now identify plants and animals that leave few or no visible remains simply by analyzing soil collected from prehistoric hearths. The evidence remains incomplete, and these techniques continue developing rapidly. Even so, they are revolutionizing understanding of ancient domestic life. What once appeared to be an ordinary patch of ash now preserves astonishing biological archives. Micromorphology offers another powerful tool. Instead of examining artifacts alone, scientists study undisturbed blocks of soil under microscopes capable of revealing structures invisible during excavation. Layers only fractions of a millimeter thick record repeated episodes of burning, sweeping, rebuilding, flooding, or abandonment. A hearth that appears simple in the field may reveal dozens of separate occupations under microscopic examination. Each thin layer represents another fire, another evening meal, another generation. Radiocarbon dating continues refining chronological understanding as well. Earlier archaeological work often produced broad estimates spanning many centuries. Modern techniques require far smaller samples and frequently achieve much greater precision. By dating multiple charcoal fragments from different layers within the same hearth, researchers reconstruct remarkably detailed occupation histories extending across generations. Still, archaeologists remain cautious. dates require careful interpretation. A piece of firewood may already have been decades old before burning. Ancient roots sometimes disturb earlier deposits. Floodwaters mix materials from different periods. Reliable conclusions depend upon combining many forms of evidence rather than relying upon a single test. Experimental archaeology provides yet another perspective. Researchers build replicas of prehistoric hearths using traditional materials and methods. They cook ancient foods, shape stone tools, prepare pigments, fire clay, and test different fuel sources under controlled conditions. These experiments help explain burn patterns, charcoal formation and artifact distributions observed during excavation. The results are often surprising. Some cooking methods leave almost no recognizable traces. Others produce distinctive heat fractures on surrounding stones. Different woods create different charcoal signatures. Repeated sweeping of hearth areas dramatically alters archaeological deposits. Such experiments remind researchers that ancient households were dynamic places shaped by daily maintenance, rather than static scenes frozen in time. Digital technology now allows discoveries from widely separated regions to be compared in unprecedented detail. Databases containing thousands of hearths reveal patterns impossible to detect at individual sites alone. Similar construction techniques appear across vast geographic areas. Changes in fuel use correspond with regional climate shifts. Settlement patterns emerge over centuries rather than decades. The story of civilization grows clearer because countless ordinary fireplaces are finally being studied together. Public archaeology has also transformed the field. Many excavations now involve local communities, students, and volunteers working alongside professional researchers. Museums increasingly emphasize everyday life rather than only kings and monumental architecture. Visitors often express surprise that one of the most meaningful discoveries at a site is not a golden ornament, but a simple fireplace where anonymous families prepared meals thousands of years ago. These discoveries reshape popular understanding of history. Civilization begins looking less like a sequence of famous rulers and more like an accumulation of ordinary human experiences. Children helping gather fuel, parents repairing tools, neighbors sharing food, elders passing knowledge across generations. The hearth becomes the central witness to all of it. Yet enormous mysteries remain. Large portions of the archaeological record have already disappeared through erosion, agriculture, urban development, and rising seas. Countless prehistoric settlements now lie beneath modern cities where excavation is impossible. Others rest beneath reservoirs, coastlines, or thick forest canopies awaiting future discovery. Scholars readily acknowledge these limitations. Every new excavation answers certain questions while raising many more. The evidence remains incomplete. Some hearths survive beautifully. Others leave only faint chemical traces. Entire regions remain poorly explored. Future technologies may uncover information unimaginable today. Perhaps the greatest lesson modern archaeology offers is humility. For generations, researchers focused primarily upon monuments because they seemed to represent civilization most clearly. Only gradually has attention shifted toward the ordinary spaces where most people actually lived. The quiet fireplace overlooked for centuries now occupies a central place in understanding humanity's past. Its ashes preserve environmental history. Its charcoal records climate. Its stones reveal domestic routines. Its surrounding soil contains fragments of forgotten meals, vanished forests, extinct animals, and countless human decisions too ordinary to enter written history. Together these humble remains illuminate a profound truth. The foundations of civilization are rarely found in places designed to impress future generations. They survive instead in the worn spaces where anonymous people cooked, worked, learned, remembered, and gathered every evening around familiar flames. Modern science has finally learned how to read those silent traces, allowing ancient hearths to speak once more not through legends or myths, but through the patient language of evidence carried across thousands of years by the earth itself. The ancient hearth is small enough to fit within a single room, yet its influence eventually reaches across continents. It does not resemble the monuments that later civilizations build to celebrate power. No ruler commissions its construction. No inscription records the names of those who tend its fire. Even so, nearly every defining feature of civilization can be traced in one way or another, back to the ordinary habits that first develop around these quiet circles of ash. The story of cities begins long before the first city exists. As villages become larger and more stable, the rhythm of everyday life changes in ways that earlier generations could scarcely imagine. A dependable food supply allows populations to grow. Growing populations encourage cooperation on a larger scale. Larger communities require increasingly reliable methods of organizing work. Storage becomes more sophisticated. Exchange expands. Knowledge accumulates rather than disappearing with each generation. None of these developments arrive suddenly. They emerge gradually from countless households whose hearths anchor daily existence. One of the most significant consequences is surplus. For much of human history, nearly every hour is devoted directly to survival. Food gathered today is consumed today. Hunting, collecting fuel, repairing tools, and finding shelter occupy almost every waking moment. As farming improves and storage becomes more dependable, some communities begin producing more food than they immediately require. Surplus changes everything. It allows certain individuals to spend more time making tools instead of gathering food. Others devote increasing attention to pottery, weaving, construction, or long-distance exchange. Knowledge deepens because practice becomes more specialized. Innovation accelerates because skilled craftspeople can refine techniques across many years. The hearth remains at the center of these households, but its surrounding world grows increasingly diverse. Archaeologists observe this transition in settlement after settlement. Workshops begin appearing alongside domestic spaces. Kilns capable of producing higher temperatures emerge from earlier hearth technologies. Grinding stones become more standardized. Storage facilities increase in both number and size. The village gradually transforms into something more economically complex. Exchange networks expand at the same time. Communities producing high-quality stone tools exchange them for shells, pigments, timber, salt, or food unavailable locally. Paths linking neighboring settlements become increasingly well-traveled. Rivers carry not only fish and drinking water, but also ideas, materials, and people. Trade does not simply distribute objects. It distributes knowledge. A technique perfected in one valley gradually appears hundreds of kilometers away. A new style of pottery spreads through repeated contact. Improved farming methods move from village to village. Civilization advances because people learn from one another. The earliest marketplaces are probably nothing more than places where neighboring communities meet during seasonal gatherings. Yet these simple exchanges establish habits that later support regional economies. Trust grows beyond immediate family. Reciprocal obligations extend across greater distances. Communities become increasingly interconnected. The humble hearth, once serving only a single household, now belongs to a society whose relationships stretch far beyond the horizon. Agriculture also reshapes the landscape itself. Fields replace portions of natural vegetation. Canals eventually direct water toward crops. Terraces appear along hillsides in certain regions. Animals graze under increasingly careful management. The environment becomes a partnership between natural processes and human intention. This transformation unfolds differently around the world. In Southwest Asia, early farming villages gradually evolve into increasingly complex settlements. Along the Nile, seasonal flooding supports remarkably productive agriculture. In parts of East Asia, rice cultivation encourages different forms of cooperation. Across the Americas, maize becomes central to societies following entirely separate historical paths. Each civilization develops unique traditions, yet all depend upon ordinary domestic routines first established around household fires. Writing itself owes an indirect debt to the hearth. The earliest writing systems do not appear because people suddenly desire literature. Instead, they emerge from practical needs created by growing settlements. Harvests must be counted. Stored grain must be recorded. Exchange agreements require memory extending beyond spoken tradition. Administrative complexity eventually demands new methods of preserving information. The road leading toward written language begins with settled households producing enough resources to make accounting worthwhile. Scholars often describe writing as one of civilization's defining achievements. That description is certainly justified. Still writing arrives astonishingly late compared with the domestic tradition supporting it. For thousands of years before the first clay tablets or carved symbols appear, knowledge already flows from generation to generation beside the hearth, through observation, memory, and shared experience. Writing expands this process. It does not replace its ancient foundations. Leadership becomes increasingly formal as well. Small villages relying primarily upon personal familiarity gradually evolve into larger communities requiring more organized decision-making. Managing irrigation systems, coordinating seasonal labor, resolving disputes over land and defending settlements, all encourage more structured forms of authority. Exactly how these institutions develop differs enormously across regions. Some emphasize councils, others favor hereditary leadership, still others combine multiple traditions. There is no single path toward government, yet all require populations large enough to make coordination necessary. Those populations grow first around countless domestic fires. Religion undergoes similar transformation. Household rituals continue, but larger communities also construct shared ceremonial spaces. Temples eventually rise above ordinary homes. Public festivals unite entire settlements. Specialists responsible for maintaining religious traditions appear. Still beneath these grand developments remains the older memory of domestic fire. Many later cultures preserve sacred hearth traditions long after monumental architecture dominates the landscape. The household flame remains a symbol of continuity, family, and belonging. In many ancient civilizations, extinguishing the domestic fire carries deep symbolic meaning precisely because it has represented the heart of community for so many generations. Cities eventually emerge. Stone walls surround expanding populations. Markets fill with merchants from distant lands. Craft districts specialize in increasingly sophisticated production. Writing records, taxes, laws, and trade. Palaces dominate skylines. Temples rise toward the heavens. Looking upon these magnificent places, it is easy to imagine civilization beginning there. The archaeological record tells a different story. Every city depends upon households. Every household depends upon food. Every meal depends upon fire. The great achievements of civilization rest upon foundations laid by ordinary families whose names have vanished. Modern archaeology increasingly emphasizes this continuity. Rather than viewing cities as abrupt inventions, researchers understand them as the cumulative result of countless gradual changes, unfolding across thousands of years. The earliest hearths reveal where these changes begin. Not through conquest, not through royal decree, not through sudden technological revolution, but through daily repetition, preparing food, sharing knowledge, raising children, repairing tools, remembering ancestors, planning for tomorrow, returning again and again to familiar places. The remarkable truth is that civilization grows from habits before it grows from institutions. Institutions merely organize practices that households have already refined across generations. The anonymous people tending those early fires could never imagine bustling marketplaces, towering temples, written literature, or vast empires stretching across continents. Yet every one of those achievements depends upon lessons first learned beside modest domestic hearths. This realization changes how the ancient world is understood. History no longer begins with kings. It begins with families. It begins with cooperation. It begins with evenings spent around shared warmth. The ashes preserved beneath archaeological sites therefore represent far more than evidence of ancient cooking. They contain the earliest chapters of humanity's collective future. From these quiet circles of charcoal emerge the first villages, the first enduring communities, the first systems of exchange, the first experiments in organized living, and eventually the civilizations whose monuments still inspire wonder today. Long before stone pyramids, royal palaces, or written chronicles reshape the landscape, the true architecture of civilization is already taking form around fires, so ordinary that the people tending them likely never imagined history would one day begin with them. If someone were to stand within one of those ancient villages watching smoke rise quietly from dozens of household fires, nothing about the scene would suggest that one of history's greatest debates is unfolding there. There are no scholars arguing beside the flames, no written theories waiting to be compared, no awareness that future generations will search these same ashes for answers about the beginning of civilization itself. Yet thousands of years later, archaeologists, historians, anthropologists and environmental scientists continue asking a question whose answer remains surprisingly elusive. Where does civilization truly begin? For generations, many researchers pointed toward agriculture. The reasoning appears straightforward. Farming supports larger populations. Larger populations create villages. Villages eventually develop into towns, cities, and states. Without reliable food production, complex civilization seems difficult to sustain. There is considerable evidence supporting this view. Early agricultural communities often display increasing population density, permanent architecture, food storage, and expanding social organization. Domesticated crops and animals dramatically reshape human relationships with the environment. Surplus food encourages specialization, exchange, and technological innovation. From this perspective, the cultivation of plants becomes the decisive turning point. Yet other scholars caution that the story is not so simple. Long before agriculture becomes widespread, many hunter-gatherer communities already demonstrate remarkable social complexity. Some construct substantial settlements. Others establish extensive exchange networks stretching across large regions. Certain groups create elaborate ceremonial sites while still relying primarily upon wild resources. These discoveries challenge older assumptions. Civilization, or at least some of its essential ingredients, may begin earlier than farming alone can explain. The hearth occupies an important place within this discussion because it predates agriculture by an immense span of time. Communal fires organize domestic life, preserve knowledge, strengthen cooperation, and encourage repeated settlement long before cultivated fields dominate the landscape. Perhaps some researchers argue the foundations of civilization emerge not when humans first grow food, but when they first begin living together in increasingly stable communities centered upon shared routines. Others emphasize cooperation itself. Human beings possess extraordinary abilities to collaborate with unrelated individuals. Shared childcare, collective hunting, food distribution, cooperative construction, and long-term planning all distinguish our species in important ways. From this perspective, civilization grows from social trust. The hearth becomes significant not because of the fire alone, but because it repeatedly gathers people into relationships extending beyond immediate survival. Every shared meal reinforces mutual dependence. Every evening, conversation strengthens collective memory. Every generation inherits not only practical skills but habits of cooperation. Without these social foundations, later institutions may never have emerged. Another school of thought highlights symbolic behavior. Researchers studying prehistoric burials, ritual sites, decorative objects, and artistic traditions suggest that civilization begins when communities develop increasingly sophisticated shared beliefs. Identity extends beyond biology. People belong not merely to families but to cultural traditions. Shared symbols unite larger populations. Common rituals strengthen social cohesion. The archaeological record preserves tantalizing hints of this process, although interpretation remains challenging. The evidence remains incomplete. Beliefs cannot be excavated as directly as stone tools or charcoal. Still, many scholars argue that shared meaning proves just as important as shared food. Environmental historians contribute yet another perspective. They emphasize humanity's growing ability to reshape landscapes deliberately, rather than simply adapting to them. Controlled burning, selective harvesting, water management, cultivation, and eventually irrigation all transform ecosystems across remarkable scales. Civilization from this viewpoint begins when humans become active ecological engineers. Again, the hearth occupies a central role. Fire is humanity's earliest large-scale environmental technology. Long before metal tools or machines exist, controlled burning modifies forests, grasslands, hunting grounds, and eventually agricultural fields. The quiet domestic fire connects directly to much broader transformations of entire landscapes. Some archaeologists resist searching for a single beginning altogether. They argue that civilization resembles a braided river rather than a straight road. Different streams converge gradually. Agriculture develops in one region, complex trade emerges elsewhere. Monumental architecture appears under different circumstances. Writing evolves independently from other innovations. No universal sequence exists. Instead, many pathways eventually intersect. This interpretation fits remarkably well with archaeological evidence gathered over recent decades. Around the world, societies experiment with different combinations of settlement cultivation, exchange, ritual leadership, and technology. Some flourish without pottery. Others build monumental structures before widespread farming. Certain regions domesticate plants long before animals. Elsewhere, the sequence unfolds differently. Human history proves astonishingly diverse. The hearth quietly accommodates all these possibilities. Whether communities hunt wild game or cultivate grain, they still gather around fire. Whether leadership remains informal or increasingly hierarchical, families still prepare meals. Whether villages contain 20 people or several hundred, domestic life continues revolving around familiar flames. Perhaps this universality explains why hearths have become so important to modern archaeological interpretation. They provide a common thread running through countless cultural variations. The debate extends even further. Some researchers ask whether civilization should be defined primarily by institutions such as governments, writing, and cities. Others argue that such definitions overlook the ordinary people whose daily lives make these institutions possible. Monuments may dominate history books, but households sustain civilizations. Without food, childcare, practical knowledge, and cooperation within domestic spaces, no palace could survive for long. This broader perspective has gradually reshaped archaeological priorities. Earlier generations often concentrated almost exclusively upon elite architecture and spectacular artifacts. Today's researchers increasingly devote equal attention to kitchens. Workshops refuse pits, storage facilities, and hearths. The ordinary has become historically significant. This shift carries important implications. It reminds us that history belongs not only to rulers but to everyone. Anonymous families preparing evening meals contribute as much to civilization's survival as famous kings issuing decrees. Most people who ever lived leave no written names. Their fires, however, leave traces. Those traces now tell stories previously overlooked. Scientific advances continue influencing the debate. Ancient DNA reveals unexpected migrations linking distant populations. Stable isotope analysis reconstructs diets with remarkable precision. Remote sensing uncovers settlements hidden beneath forests and deserts. Climate records reveal environmental pressures once invisible. Each discovery adds new complexity rather than simplifying the picture. The origin of civilization becomes richer, broader, and more interconnected. Simple explanations gradually give way to nuanced understanding. What emerges most clearly is continuity. The great achievements of later civilizations do not appear from nowhere. They grow slowly from practices already deeply embedded within ordinary life, preparing food, sharing resources, teaching children, remembering ancestors, maintaining homes, planning for uncertain seasons, cooperating with neighbours, adapting to changing environments. The hearth quietly unites all these activities. It is therefore possible that the search for a single defining moment misses the deeper truth altogether. Civilization may never have begun on one particular day. No trumpet announces its arrival. No ancient observer witnesses history crossing an invisible threshold. Instead, civilization emerges gradually, almost invisibly, through millions of repeated decisions made by ordinary people responding creatively to the opportunities and challenges surrounding them. The fire burning in one household contributes almost nothing by itself. Thousands of similar fires tended faithfully across generations and continents gradually transform humanity's relationship with the world. That realization perhaps explains why archaeologists continue returning to these humble circles of ash. They are not searching merely for evidence of cooking. They are searching for the earliest moments when scattered human lives begin weaving themselves into enduring communities, shared traditions, and collective futures. The answers remain incomplete, and scholars will undoubtedly continue debating them for many years to come. Yet with every newly excavated hearth, the quiet beginnings of civilization become just a little easier to see, not as a single invention, but as a patient accumulation of ordinary lives, lived together around the enduring gift of fire. The last embers of the evening glow quietly beneath a layer of pale ash. Around them the village settles into silence. Children who spent the day gathering wood or chasing one another between houses are asleep. The tools used to shape stone, grind grain, weave fibres, and repair hunting spears rest where they will be found again at dawn. Beyond the edge of the settlement, the darkness belongs to forests, rivers, and distant hills whose rhythms continue unchanged. Nothing about this final scene appears extraordinary, yet within its quiet simplicity lies one of the greatest achievements in human history. The people tending these fires never call themselves founders of civilization. They do not imagine that thousands of years later archaeologists will kneel beside the remains of their hearths, carefully brushing away soil grain by grain. They never expect future scientists to analyze the charcoal from their cooking fires under powerful microscopes or extract ancient DNA from the sediments beneath their homes. They simply wake each morning, gather fuel, prepare food, care for children, repair tools, watch the seasons, and return to the same familiar places, because experience has taught them that those places sustain life. History often celebrates dramatic moments: the rise of kingdoms, the construction of pyramids, the invention of writing, the victories of armies, the reigns of powerful rulers. These events deserve their place in the historical record, but they can also create the illusion that civilization is built through extraordinary acts performed by extraordinary people. The ancient hearth suggests something different. It reminds us that history is more often shaped by ordinary routines repeated with remarkable consistency across countless generations. Every civilization begins with breakfast before it begins with bureaucracy. Every city depends upon families before it depends upon governments. Every written language follows thousands of years of spoken stories shared around evening fires. The archaeological evidence accumulated over the past century increasingly supports this broader perspective. Across Africa, Europe, Asia, Australia, and the Americas, researchers continue uncovering settlements whose greatest treasures are not royal tombs, but domestic spaces, blackened stones, burned seeds, broken grinding tools, fragments of charcoal, layers of ash. These humble remains preserve a record of humanity that monuments alone could never provide. They reveal how people actually lived, how they adapted, how they cooperated, how they endured, perhaps most importantly, they reveal how civilization grows from relationships rather than structures. The hearth gathers families. Families form households. Households become neighborhoods. Neighborhoods develop into villages. Villages connect through exchange. Networks expand into regions. Regions eventually support cities, kingdoms, and civilizations. At every stage, the basic human need to gather around warmth, food, memory, and shared labor remains remarkably constant. This continuity stretches across astonishing spans of time. A person preparing bread in one of the earliest farming villages would recognize many familiar movements in a modern kitchen. A parent teaching a child how to tend a fire thousands of years ago participates in the same ancient tradition of passing knowledge from one generation to the next. The tools have changed. The buildings have changed. The scale of society has changed beyond imagination. Yet certain habits remain deeply recognizable. Scholars often describe civilization as a triumph of innovation, and in many ways it certainly is. Agriculture transforms food production. Writing preserves ideas. Metallurgy reshapes technology. Engineering changes landscapes. Science expands understanding. But innovation alone never explains why civilizations endure. Endurance depends upon continuity, upon countless ordinary people maintaining daily life through periods of prosperity, uncertainty, conflict, and environmental change. The hearth symbolizes that continuity more clearly than almost any other archaeological feature. Its fire must be tended every day. Neglected for too long, it fades. Civilization itself follows a similar pattern. It cannot survive through monuments alone. It survives because generation after generation continues the quiet work of feeding families, preserving knowledge, adapting to change, and cooperating with neighbors. Even collapse rarely destroys these deeper traditions completely. Empires disappear. Cities are abandoned. Languages evolve. Political systems rise and fall. Yet domestic life persists. People continue preparing meals. They continue raising children. They continue gathering in shared spaces where stories, skills, and memories pass between generations. This resilience explains why civilization repeatedly recovers after periods of crisis. Its strongest foundations lie not in institutions but in households. Modern archaeology continues uncovering evidence that reinforces this understanding. Every newly excavated hearth adds another voice to a conversation spanning tens of thousands of years. Some discoveries refine existing theories, others overturn long-held assumptions. Future research will almost certainly reveal even more surprising chapters of humanity's early history. Perhaps ancient settlements still hidden beneath forests, deserts, coastlines, or modern cities will reshape current understanding once again. The evidence remains incomplete. It always will. Much of the past has disappeared forever through erosion, changing landscapes, and the simple passage of time. Yet enough survives to illuminate an extraordinary truth. Civilization does not begin with grandeur. It begins with care. Care for fire, care for food, care for children, care for elders, care for knowledge, care for places worth returning to. Those acts of care accumulate across generations until they become something far greater than the individuals performing them. Looking back across the immense span of prehistory, it becomes clear that the earliest builders of civilization rarely intended to build civilization at all. They sought shelter from winter winds, reliable water during dry seasons, safe places to raise children, enough food to survive another year. Their ambitions were immediate. Their achievements became timeless. The quiet circles of ash they left behind now allow modern researchers to reconstruct a story far older than kings or kingdoms. A story measured not in battles won or monuments raised, but in evenings shared around familiar fires. Perhaps that is why these ancient hearths continue to resonate so deeply today. They remind us that beneath every technological advance and every political transformation remains something fundamentally human. The desire to gather, to share warmth, to prepare food together, to teach the next generation, to remember those who came before, to hope that tomorrow's fire will burn again. These simple acts repeated patiently over thousands of years create the invisible framework upon which every later civilization is built. The first great cities do not appear because humanity suddenly becomes civilized. They appear because civilization has already been quietly taking shape for countless generations beside ordinary household fires. Long before stone walls enclosed cities or written laws governed nations, the ancient hearth had already begun teaching humanity how to live together, how to remember together, and how to build a future one shared evening at a time. The fire grows quieter as the night settles over the ancient settlement. The conversations have faded into silence. The last pieces of wood collapse gently into glowing embers, sending a few final sparks upward before they disappear into the darkness. Beyond the circle of light, the familiar landscape waits patiently. The river continues its slow journey toward distant valleys. Wind moves softly through grasses that have witnessed countless generations come and go. Somewhere beyond the hills, another small fire burns in another village tended by people who will never know the names of those gathered here yet whose lives follow the same gentle rhythm. Time has erased nearly everything these families built. Their roofs have long since fallen. Their woven baskets have returned to the earth. Their wooden tools have vanished into the soil. Even their footprints disappeared thousands of years ago. Yet the places where they gathered remain. Beneath quiet fields and forgotten forests, beneath modern farms and growing towns, the earth still holds faint circles of charcoal and ash. Those silent traces continue to remind us that the beginning of civilization was never loud. It arrived without ceremony. No trumpet announced its birth. No monument marked the occasion. Instead, it unfolded through ordinary evenings when people chose to stay one more season to care for one another, through another winter, to teach another child how to keep a fire alive until morning. Perhaps that is why these ancient hearths feel so familiar even today. Across thousands of years and countless cultures, homes have continued to gather around places of warmth. The materials have changed from stone circles to brick fireplaces, iron stoves, and modern kitchens. Yet the purpose has remained remarkably constant. People still come together to prepare food, to share stories, to celebrate, to grieve, to welcome new life, and to remember those who are gone. The quiet fire at the heart of the home has outlived kingdoms. It has survived changing languages, shifting climates, collapsing empires, and the passing of entire civilizations. Its greatest legacy is not the ash left behind, but the habit of gathering. As the ancient embers finally cool beneath the night sky, they leave behind more than the remains of a forgotten meal. They leave the first enduring promise that people can build something greater than themselves through patience, cooperation, and memory. From those modest circles of warmth, humanity slowly learns not only how to survive, but how to belong to one another, to the land beneath their feet, and to the long unfolding story of time itself. And somewhere beneath the quiet earth, hidden beneath centuries of wind and rain, those ancient hearths continue to wait, holding their silent memories, until careful hands uncover them once again, reminding us that the greatest beginnings are often the quietest.